Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What kind of world quietly shapes the mind of a boy who will one day alter the course of an entire continent? It is easy, looking back through the long corridors of history, to imagine that greatness appears suddenly and fully formed. Yet the truth is usually quieter. It begins with a child observing the world around him, watching adults speak about power, hearing stories of distant wars, learning how communities change when larger forces arrive from far beyond the horizon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight, along with your local time. I always enjoy seeing how many different corners of the world these stories travel to. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sea wind of Corsica carried with it the scent of wild thyme and salt. On the 15th of August, 1769, in the hilltop town of Ajaccio, a child was born who would one day reorder the world. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. The family home overlooked the restless Mediterranean, where the waves crashed like the heartbeat of destiny. In that same summer, Corsica had just fallen from its brief independence into the control of France. The newborn's cries, mingling with the echoes of rebellion, seemed to announce a life bound to struggle between belonging and conquest. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Ramolino, was strong, disciplined, and deeply pious. She survived revolts, poverty, and uncertainty with quiet endurance, shaping her children with the same iron beneath gentleness that would later define her son. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, a lawyer with lofty ambitions, served as a representative of Corsican interests to the French crown. Their family, though noble in name, lived modestly. They carried dignity as their inheritance, not wealth. From childhood, Napoleon felt himself different. His siblings played along the stone alleys of Ajaccio, but he often withdrew to the hills, where he would sit among olive trees and stare toward the mainland, a land of kings, armies, and stories. He read of Caesar, Alexander, and Hannibal, feeling something stir inside him. It was not envy, but recognition. Even as a boy, he dreamed not merely to witness history, but to become its instrument. Corsica was a proud land, fiercely protective of its identity. Yet its people were poor, and their fierce independence clashed with the practical reality of French rule. Young Napoleon absorbed this duality, the stubborn pride of his island blood and the allure of the greater world that had conquered it. In his earliest essays, written as a schoolboy, he defended Corsican freedom with passionate rhetoric, calling France an oppressor. Ironically, it was that same France that would later carry him to glory. At 9 years old, his father secured him a scholarship to the military school at Brienne-le-Château in France. The boy, small and dark-haired, arrived speaking French with a thick Corsican accent. His classmates mocked his manners, his voice, his origins. Little savage, some called him. The taunts hardened him. In the solitude of the academy gardens, he swore to himself that he would rise so high that they would bow to him. Brienne became his crucible. He devoured books on mathematics and history, mastering the geometry of artillery as easily as he absorbed the tactics of ancient warfare. His teachers noted both his silence and his intensity. He spoke little but wrote constantly letters, reflections, plans. He found in study the first taste of control, of shaping chaos into precision. Snow-covered winters saw him building forts from ice, commanding classmates in mock sieges. There, under the grey skies of Champagne, the future conqueror first practiced command. He graduated to the École Militaire in Paris, completing a 2-year course in just one. When his father died in 1785, leaving the family in debt, Napoleon bore the weight of responsibility as if it were armour. At 16, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery. While his peers spent freely, he saved every coin to send home to his mother and siblings. The army was his ladder, but his heart remained tethered to his family, to Corsica, and to the restless fire inside him. The France that awaited him was a nation teetering on the edge of transformation. The old monarchy glittered with decay. The people murmured of liberty. From the garrisons of Valence and Auxonne, Napoleon watched this slow eruption with fascination. He walked through villages where peasants starved and nobles dined. He noted, as only a strategist could, the weakness in the structure. In letters he wrote of the coming storm, long before the Bastille fell. Yet while he wore the uniform of France, his loyalties were divided. When Corsica again attempted rebellion, he wrote passionately in defence of its leader, Pasquale Paoli, calling him the father of our liberty. For a time, Napoleon saw himself as a Corsican patriot rather than a French officer. He returned to his island after the revolution began, seeking to aid its independence. But politics and betrayal turned against him. Paoli distrusted him. Rivals accused him of ambition. When Paoli sided with the British, Napoleon found himself branded a traitor to his homeland. The Bonapartes were forced to flee, their house burned, their name cursed by neighbours. They escaped to France as refugees. Napoleon, bitter and penniless, shed the Corsican identity that had defined him. He began signing his name Bonaparte, the French spelling. In that simple alteration, the boy from Ajaccio severed the last tie to his island and stepped fully into the world stage. Paris was in turmoil when he returned. The revolution had exploded, devouring kings and courtiers alike. Streets echoed with chants of liberty, equality, fraternity, and the crack of guillotines. The army, purged of nobles, was desperate for officers who could think, command, and win. Napoleon, 24, and burning with suppressed purpose, found his moment. He was stationed with artillery units near Toulon, where royalists, aided by the British fleet, had seized the port in rebellion against the new republic. The siege dragged on for months, until a young captain offered a plan. He proposed a new positioning of the batteries, concentrating fire on key British ships rather than walls. His superiors doubted him. He executed the plan himself. The results were decisive. In December 1793, Toulon fell. The British fled. France had a new name on its lips: Bonaparte. For the first time, Napoleon felt the intoxication of destiny fulfilled. He had been mocked for his accent, scorned for his birth, doubted for his ambition. Now he walked among the ruins of Toulon as the Republic's hero, the smell of powder and victory in the air. The young artillery officer had proven that intellect could outmatch rank, that genius could carve its place by force of will. But beneath the triumph, a quiet hunger stirred. He began to see war not as chaos but as an art. The battlefield was his canvas, soldiers, his instruments, movement, his language. Every victory, every retreat, every cannonball told a story of geometry, courage, and fate. He studied not merely how to win, but how to command hearts to bind men to his will through words, vision, and the promise of glory. The following years would draw him deeper into that art and deeper into himself. The revolution had torn down old thrones, but in the ashes, new empires waited to be born. France was restless, leaderless, yearning for direction, and somewhere in the smoky salons of Paris, among generals and politicians, someone whispered that name again: Bonaparte. He was not yet 30. His uniform was still modest, his sword plain, his lodging simple. But his eyes, sharp, grey-blue, watchful, held that peculiar calm that precedes a storm. History had tilted toward him, though neither it nor he yet knew how far it would fall. He began to write letters to friends describing his vision for France order restored without tyranny, merit rewarded without birthright, power earned, not inherited. Yet behind those ideals lay ambition vast enough to frighten the heavens. He was not content to be a soldier. He wanted to shape nations. In dim candlelight, he drafted essays on leadership, drawing from Caesar and Machiavelli. insisting that the destiny of peoples was forged by will. He studied maps not for battles but for the movement of civilization. He saw himself not merely as a commander of armies but as a sculptor of the age. Those around him saw only a brilliant officer. Few understood that beneath his reserved demeanour lay the most dangerous force in history, belief in his own inevitability. At night, in his quarters, he would read by the glow of a single flame. He wrote of glory, not as vanity, but as purpose, the immortality that only action can grant. He spoke of destiny as if it were a mountain, waiting for those who dared to climb. In the stillness of those early years, before crowns and continents, Napoleon Bonaparte was already forming the mind that saw order in chaos, the heart that craved greatness, the will that would bend empires. Corsica had given him spirit. France would give him command. The world, soon enough, would give him its awe. And as dawn broke over the Seine, gilding the horizon with the same light that once touched the hills of Ajaccio, a young officer looked out his window and whispered a silent vow, to rise, always to rise, until the summit itself bends before me. The drums of France were beating faster. The revolution's fever burned hot. Across Europe, kings watched with trembling hands as a nation of citizens replaced crowns with ideals. But ideals need form, and revolutions need order. The Republic's armies were brave, but chaotic. They needed a mind sharp enough to harness fire, and cold enough to direct it. In that furnace of history, Napoleon would soon emerge not as another officer, but as a force beyond any single nation. Before him lay Italy, Egypt, and empire. Behind him, a small island fading into memory, and within him, the quiet conviction that the world itself was waiting to be conquered. The sea wind of Corsica still echoed in his mind, wild, unyielding, eternal. The young officer who once studied in silence at Brienne was no longer a nameless soldier in the ranks. After Toulon, Napoleon Bonaparte's name travelled swiftly through France's restless corridors of power. Yet fame in revolutionary France was a treacherous gift. One could be celebrated one week and condemned the next. The guillotine did not discriminate between traitors and heroes. The revolution devoured its own children, and only those who mastered its tide survived. Napoleon's next trial would come not from a battlefield, but from the chaos of Paris itself. In the autumn of 1795, the French capital was seething. The Convention, the governing body of the revolution, was under siege from royalist uprisings. Cannon fire echoed in the streets, and mobs shouted for the restoration of the monarchy. The government, desperate for salvation, turned to a 26-year-old general known for his composure under fire. He arrived with calm authority, scanning the streets that once scorned him. His solution was swift and ruthless. He ordered grapeshot fired into the charging crowd. The rebellion collapsed in moments. The streets fell silent beneath the smoke. Parisians would later call it the whiff of grapeshot, a grim perfume, announcing the arrival of order and of Napoleon's ascendancy. For his loyalty and effectiveness, he was made commander of the Army of the Interior, but Napoleon was no politician. He disliked the chatter of salons and the empty rhetoric of assemblies. He preferred action to speech, plans to debates. Still, he understood power, how it shifted, how it could be seized. And now, the eyes of Paris turned toward the young general with the iron will and strange magnetic confidence. In those days, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of charm and grace, slightly older than him, whose social connections opened doors even victory could not. She was elegant, poised, and surrounded by admirers. Napoleon, awkward yet intense, fell quickly and completely. His letters burned with passion and obsession, filled with longing that bordered on command. "I awake full of you," he wrote. "Your portrait and yesterday's intoxicating evening have left my senses in turmoil." They married in March 1796. 2 days later, Napoleon left to take command of the army of Italy. He kissed Josephine's hand, promised triumph, and rode off toward a campaign that would immortalize his name. Italy in the spring of 1796 was a patchwork of decaying kingdoms and Austrian garrisons. France's army there was underfed, unpaid, and demoralised. Many officers expected failure. But when Napoleon arrived, everything changed. He was small in stature, pale, and still spoke with a Corsican accent. But when he spoke, his soldiers listened. His words, sharp as his strategy, ignited them. "Soldiers," he declared, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honour, glory, and riches." What followed was lightning warfare. He moved with unprecedented speed, dividing his forces to strike where the enemy was weakest, then reuniting them with mathematical precision. He turned geography into an ally, manoeuvring through the Alps with impossible agility. Within weeks he defeated armies twice his size. At Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole, he shattered the Austrian and Piedmontese forces. His soldiers began to call him the Little Corporal, a term of affection for a commander who fought beside them, shared their dangers, and understood their hearts. The nickname became legend, symbolising a leader who rose by merit, not birth. At Lodi, his troops hesitated before a bridge held by Austrian cannons. Bullets tore through the air, men faltered. Napoleon seized a flag, charged forward through smoke and fire, and crossed the bridge himself. The sight electrified his men. They surged after him, and victory followed. That night, Napoleon wrote that it was at Lodi he first felt the spark of destiny. By the end of the campaign, northern Italy was transformed. Cities that had stood for centuries under foreign rule now bowed to French banners. In every town, people cheered the young general whose victories promised a new age. He established republics modelled on revolutionary France, spreading ideals of liberty even as he secured France's dominance. But for Napoleon, Italy was more than conquest, it was revelation. He discovered the art of power, how to command men's loyalty, how to bend politics to his design, how to weave military and civic reform into one grand vision. He issued proclamations not merely as orders but as poetry. His soldiers adored him. His enemies studied him. He wrote reports to Paris that read like manifestos, blending strategy with philosophy. "A man like me," he told one aide, "does not stop halfway up the mountain." The victories brought wealth and admiration, but also suspicion. In Paris, the Directory, the governing council, feared him. A general adored by his army was a dangerous thing in a republic still haunted by tyranny. To distract him, and perhaps to remove him from Europe, they gave him command of an expedition to Egypt. In 1798, Napoleon sailed from Toulon with 38,000 soldiers, accompanied not only by cannons but by scholars, artists, and scientists. It was an invasion, yes, but also an enlightenment. He sought to strike at Britain's empire by cutting off its route to India, and to bring the light of modern science to the ancient land of the pharaohs. The voyage was perilous. At sea, the fleet dodged the British Navy under Admiral Nelson. They landed near Alexandria in July. The sun of Egypt was unlike anything the French had known, relentless, blinding, almost divine in its severity. Yet Napoleon's troops pressed on, marching through sand and heat to confront the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. "From the heights of these pyramids," he told his men, 40 centuries look down upon you. With disciplined volleys and modern tactics, the French shattered the Mamluk ranks. The ancient land fell under their control. Cairo was taken, but triumph soon turned hollow. Disease ravaged the army. Supplies dwindled. The British fleet destroyed the French ships at the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon in Egypt. The dream of an Eastern Empire began to fade beneath the desert stars. Still, the expedition left an enduring mark. The scholars catalogued monuments, discovered the Rosetta Stone, and opened the West's eyes to Egypt's grandeur. Napoleon, ever aware of image, ensured that France saw only glory. His dispatches spoke of victories and civilization, not of hardship or loss. But France was changing again. The Directory was failing, corruption spreading, and Europe's coalitions were reforming. Napoleon sensed his time had come. In 1799, leaving his army behind, he sailed back to France through perilous seas, evading the British patrols as if destiny itself guided the winds. When he arrived in Paris, he found a nation weary of instability, longing for strength. His name alone stirred crowds to hope. He met with political allies, including the cunning Sieyès, and together they planned what history would call the coup of Brumaire. On the 9th of November 1799, soldiers loyal to him surrounded the councils of government. Amid confusion and shouts of treason, Napoleon strode into the chamber. "Citizens," he declared, "the revolution is over." By the next dawn, France had a new ruler, its First Consul. The Republic still existed in name, but the true power now rested in one man's hands. The boy from Corsica, mocked for his accent and birth, now commanded a nation of 40 million souls. He had risen not by inheritance, but by will. And as he stood once more at the threshold of history, Napoleon Bonaparte's soldier, strategist, dreamer, looked toward a new horizon. France was weary of chaos. He would give it order. Europe was fractured by monarchy. He would give it unity or subjugation. He was 29 years old. His hair already showed the faint stress of ambition. His gaze had the stillness of calculation. Those who met him often said that when he looked at you, he seemed to see not your face, but your purpose. The revolution had created him, but now he would define what came after. The world would no longer speak of liberty or tyranny without thinking of his name. The soldier had become a statesman, the general a visionary, but within that transformation, the same fire burned, a hunger for mastery, a refusal to yield, and an almost mystical belief that fate itself had chosen him. In the quiet of the Tuileries palace where he now resided, the young consul often worked through the night. Papers filled his desk, maps lined the walls, and candles burned low. Outside, the city slept, uncertain whether it had been saved or conquered. And in the still hours before dawn, Napoleon would pause, look out over Paris, and whisper to the darkness, "The revolution is not over. It has only changed hands." The boy from Corsica had risen beyond the island, beyond the army, beyond the Republic itself. Ahead lay empire, and the world trembling before it, revolution and opportunity. The storm that had consumed France continued to darken across Europe, reshaping crowns, faiths, and frontiers. What began as a cry for liberty had become a whirlpool of ambition and violence, and within it, Napoleon Bonaparte stood poised, balancing genius against the perils of power. The year was 1800, and the world was beginning to sense that one man might soon determine its destiny. As First Consul, Napoleon inherited a nation exhausted by revolution, drained of wealth, torn by ideology, and haunted by the ghosts of kings and guillotines. The air of Paris carried not only smoke from forges and bakeries, but the murmurs of uncertainty. The ideals of liberty had promised equality, yet only chaos had followed. Napoleon, ever attuned to the rhythm of history, understood that France no longer wanted to dream. It wanted to rest, to rebuild, and to believe in strength. He began at once to restore order. Taxes were reorganized, corruption hunted out, roads and canals repaired, and the great institutions of France slowly revived under a new discipline. He was everywhere reading reports, revising decrees, walking unannounced through the streets to hear the pulse of his people. Ministers feared his gaze, clerks straightened at his approach. His handwriting, sharp and precise, appeared on every document that mattered. He worked 16 hours a day, dictating letters faster than his secretaries could keep up, consuming details as if they were fuel for the immense engine of his will. He abolished the chaos of revolutionary calendars and restored stability to the franc. Churches reopened, the clergy returned cautiously to their altars. He spoke not of revenge, but of unity. "We have finished the romance of revolution," he declared. "It is time to begin its history." France, weary and wounded, followed him with relief. Yet even as he built peace at home, war called from beyond the mountains. The Second Coalition of Europe, Austria, Britain, Russia, had sworn to destroy revolutionary France and crush the young general who now ruled it. The army in Italy, once triumphant under his command, was pressed back toward the Alps. To lose there would unravel everything. Napoleon saw that victory was not only necessary for France but essential for his own survival. In the spring of 1800, he led a new army across the Alps. The journey became legend. Snow buried the passes, winds tore at the banners, horses slipped upon the icy stones. Yet the columns advanced like ghosts through the white silence. On a narrow path above the clouds, a peasant guide pointed toward the treacherous trail ahead. Napoleon rode at the centre, his uniform soaked, his face expressionless beneath the cold. The painter Jacques-Louis David would later immortalise the moment, showing him calm atop a rearing stallion, cloak billowing like destiny itself. In truth, he crossed on a humble mule, but the myth suited the man. On the 14th of June 1800, the armies met near the Italian village of Marengo. The French were caught off guard, their lines bending under the Austrian assault. For hours, defeat loomed. Yet Napoleon refused to retreat. He rode among the ranks, rallying the broken divisions, calling for reinforcements that arrived just as the sun began to sink. With a final charge, the French turned the tide. The Austrians broke, retreating into the twilight. Marengo was more than a battle, it was resurrection. The Republic stood firm, the Consul invincible. News of the victory spread like fire across France. Bells rang in every village, crowds filled the squares shouting his name. Europe, listening, understood that the Corsican was no passing figure but a rising empire in human form. In the months that followed, Napoleon turned victory into vision. He established the Bank of France, creating the stability that the revolution had destroyed. He restructured education, founding the lycees that would train generations in discipline and reason. Roads and bridges connected the provinces to Paris, the beating heart of his design. Even his enemies admired the clarity of his reforms. The revolution's wild energy, which had burned uncontrolled for a decade, was now harnessed under one will. In 1801, he sought reconciliation with the Church through the Concordat signed with Pope Pius VII. It was not faith that guided him, but strategy. He knew that religion was a language understood by the masses, and by restoring it, he could soothe a nation torn between faith and reason. The altars reopened, the bells rang again, and the people saw in Napoleon not the destroyer of old France, but the restorer of its dignity. Meanwhile, in his private life, the cracks began to show. Josephine, though charming and adored in Parisian salons, had failed to provide him an heir. Their marriage, once fiery with passion, cooled under the weight of ambition. Napoleon's heart was restless. He loved power as others love beauty. Every triumph fed his desire for the next. He was loyal to no single world, neither Corsican, nor Republican, nor monarchist, but only to the unfolding of his destiny. In 1802, with France secure and Europe momentarily at peace, the people voted overwhelmingly to make him consul for life. The revolution, born from the hatred of monarchy, had unknowingly crowned a ruler. He accepted the title with studied humility, but his mind was already on greater things. He began to envision not merely the salvation of France, but the reorganization of all Europe. The ancient monarchies, with their powdered wigs and decaying traditions, seemed to him relics of a past unworthy of the modern age. He would replace them with a new order efficient, rational, and loyal to his authority. The first step toward that dream was the Napoleonic Code. It became the spine of his legacy, the legal architecture of modern France. Equality before the law, secular authority, property rights principles, born in revolution, refined under his order. Lawyers, scholars, and judges laboured for months beneath his direction, distilling the chaos of centuries into a single lucid system. He corrected drafts, debated clauses, and even dictated phrasing. When completed, the code spread far beyond France, shaping the laws of nations for generations. But order was never enough for him. Peace bored him. He needed motion, conflict, the exhilaration of challenge. He once wrote, "A soldier's glory is like a woman's beauty. It fades when it rests." And so, as alliances shifted and Britain once again armed itself against France, Napoleon prepared for war anew. He gathered troops on the northern coast, intending to strike across the Channel, but the Royal Navy remained supreme. Frustrated yet undeterred, he turned his gaze eastward. The map of Europe, long divided by dynasties, seemed to him a chessboard awaiting his hand. Each campaign would not only expand France but prove his own divinity of will. In 1804, a new conspiracy against his life convinced him that titles alone could not protect the nation or himself. If he were to be the guardian of France's destiny, it must be through an institution eternal, one that carried the sanctity of empire. The Senate proposed what he already desired: Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Paris awoke that December beneath banners and bells. The coronation was held in the great cathedral of Notre Dame. The Pope himself came to preside, but when the moment arrived, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it upon his own head. The gesture shocked Europe and thrilled France. It was both rebellion and declaration. No divine right, no blessing from heaven only will, pure and sovereign. Then, turning to Josephine, he crowned her empress. That day, the revolution died completely, reborn as empire. The republic that had begun with cries of freedom ended with the coronation of one man. Yet the people rejoiced. They saw not tyranny but strength, not vanity but salvation from the chaos that had haunted them. Outside the cathedral, snow began to fall over Paris, soft and white upon the banners. The bells tolled as dusk settled over the Seine, and across the continent, monarchs shivered in their palaces. The age of kings had given birth to a new Caesar. From that moment, Napoleon ruled not as a servant of revolution but as its conqueror. He reorganized his government into the machinery of empire. Marshals of France replaced the generals of the Republic. Noble titles were revived, and palaces once owned by princes became his throne rooms. He moved through them with the calm certainty of a man fulfilling prophecy. Beyond the borders, Europe braced itself. Coalitions formed and reformed, driven by fear and pride. But Napoleon's armies, drilled to perfection, stood ready. Their banners carried not the fleur-de-lis of the old monarchy, but the golden eagle, symbol of Rome, reborn. Under its wings marched peasants, clerks, and scholars, men who had never dreamed of glory until they followed him. They marched not for France alone, but for the man who embodied its spirit. The revolution had made France a republic of citizens. Napoleon made it a nation of soldiers. His generals worshipped his precision, his daring, his uncanny sense for timing. His enemies feared his silence, for it always came before movement. He wrote of war as if it were geometry, but in battle it was poetry, each manoeuvre unfolding like a stanza written in fire and smoke. From the ashes of revolution, Napoleon had built an empire of order. Yet beneath the grandeur, the shadow of ambition stretched long. Power, once tasted, demanded more. He would soon find that the same force that lifted him above the world would one day turn against him, as the revolution had turned against its own creators. For now, the empire glittered. Paris shone brighter than it ever had under kings. The Tuileries hummed with diplomats, scholars, artists, and generals. The streets filled with the rhythm of drums and parades, and across Europe, the name Napoleon became both legend and warning. From the wild coasts of Corsica to the vaulted arches of Notre Dame, The journey had taken him across every threshold of ambition. Yet deep within, he remained what he had always been, a solitary dreamer with a restless mind, forever climbing toward the summit that forever receded. The revolution had given him opportunity. He had seized it, reshaped it, and outlived it. The world was now his stage and history, his willing audience. The boy who once sat beneath the olive trees of Ajaccio had become the master of Europe's destiny. And as dawn broke over Paris, reflecting off the gilded dome of Les Invalides, Napoleon stood before the mirror in his chambers, the imperial robes heavy on his shoulders. He saw not the face of a man, but the outline of an age. The siege of Toulon. Before the empire, before the marble palaces and the golden eagles, there had been smoke, blood, and a young officer standing before his first true test. Toulon, the coastal fortress, where his name first rose like a spark from obscurity, was where the soldier became something more. It was where ambition first tasted triumph, and the quiet Corsican lieutenant stepped into the endless hunger of command. The year was 1793, and the French Revolution had devoured its monarchy and now threatened to devour itself. Across the country, royalists and rebels clashed in 100 scattered uprisings. The port of Toulon, vital to the French navy, had fallen into the hands of monarchists who invited the British fleet for protection. The tricolour flag was torn down. The white banner of the Bourbons flew once more. For the fledgling republic, the loss was intolerable. A ragged army of revolutionaries was sent to retake the city, but chaos reigned among its officers. Orders contradicted orders. The artillery stood disorganised. Morale hung by a thread. In the midst of this confusion, a thin young captain of artillery was assigned to the front. He was 24 years old, dark-haired, restless, and burning with quiet precision. His name meant little then Bonaparte, one of thousands seeking place and purpose in a nation on fire. When he arrived, he surveyed the siege with cold eyes. The enemy held the harbour and the high ground, defended by British guns and the discipline of professionals. The revolutionary forces lacked powder, maps and command, but Napoleon's mind, trained on mathematics and honed by obsession, saw what others did not: a flaw, a pattern, a key. He studied the terrain, the positions of every battery, every slope, and every shadow. While others argued over bravery, he measured distance. He calculated angles, wind, and range. His plans, once dismissed as theory, became revelation. He proposed a daring strategy. Concentrate fire on a specific point, the little Gibraltar fort that guarded the British ships. Seize it, and the harbour would fall. At first, the senior officers laughed at the idea. He was too young, too untested. Yet when he spoke, there was something in his tone, calm, inevitable, like the voice of geometry itself. They yielded. Through days and nights, he laboured among his men, supervising the placement of cannon with obsessive care. He moved among the batteries, coated in mud and powder smoke, sleeping little, eating rarely. He spoke directly to the gunners, teaching them precision, urging them to remember that every shot could shift the course of history. The soldiers began to feel a strange faith in him. He was not like other officers. He neither barked nor flattered. He commanded through clarity. When the assault came, it was thunder and flame. Cannon roared across the hills. The night sky burned red. British ships replied with volleys of fire that shook the earth. Yet the French batteries, guided by Napoleon's calculations, found their mark. Shells rained down upon little Gibraltar, tearing through defences, silencing guns one by one. In the chaos, a shell exploded near Napoleon's post, scattering men and earth. He rose, his face blackened with soot, his uniform torn, his calm unbroken. He gave the next order as if nothing had occurred. To those who saw him, he seemed carved from iron. The assault continued for days until, at last, the position was taken. The British fleet, under heavy bombardment, withdrew in haste, setting fire to their own ships to prevent capture. The tricolour rose once again over Toulon. France had retaken its harbour. The victory stunned the nation. Reports reached Paris of a young artillery officer whose plans had saved the Republic. General Dugommier, his commander, declared, "This man has everything he needs to become a great general except age." Napoleon's name spread through the army like rumour, and through the government like warning. He was promoted to brigadier general at 24. For the first time, he signed his letters with confidence Bonaparte, the name now spoken with awe and curiosity. But Toulon was not only a triumph of arms, it was a revelation of self. Standing amid the ruins, the smoke still drifting over the harbour, Napoleon looked upon the fallen fortress and felt something awaken within him. It was not joy nor pride, it was a sensation deeper and more dangerous, certainty. He had discovered that war could be art, and that his mind could paint with fire. The geometry of destruction thrilled him, not for bloodshed, but for the perfection of its design. Each movement of troops, each placement of cannon, each curve of the battlefield was a composition. He had not merely fought a battle, he had orchestrated one. From that moment, he knew that victory was not a matter of chance or courage, but of calculation. He believed he could master it, as one masters music or language. The victory also brought him power, small at first, then growing. He was given command of the artillery in the army of Italy, though political shifts soon placed him under suspicion. In the Revolution, heroes rose and fell with terrifying speed. The guillotine had little patience for fame. When his patrons were executed during the Reign of Terror, Napoleon found himself imprisoned for weeks. Yet fate, as if reluctant to lose its chosen instrument, spared him. After Robespierre's fall, he was released, gaunt but unbroken. He returned to duty, now tempered by experience. He had glimpsed both the heights of glory and the abyss of obscurity, and he understood how thin the line was between them. He spent the next years studying maps, tactics, and politics, learning not only how to command, but how to survive. He wrote essays on the art of war, meditated on Caesar's campaigns, and always waited for his next opportunity. That chance came in 1795, when the royalist uprising in Paris threatened the government itself. The Directory needed a commander bold enough to restore order and merciless enough to succeed. Barras, who remembered the young artillery officer of Toulon, summoned him. Within hours, Napoleon's cannons lined the streets of Paris. When the royalist mob advanced, he ordered grapeshot to be fired directly into their ranks. In minutes, the rebellion dissolved into smoke and silence. The government was saved, the Republic survived another day, and Napoleon Bonaparte, once the obscure Corsican, became the saviour of France. From that day forward, his rise was unstoppable. Toulon had been his proving ground, Paris his platform. Within months, he would command the army of Italy, where victory upon victory would lift him to legend. But Toulon remained the seed, the moment where ambition first became reality. He would never forget the smell of gunpowder in the cold night air, the sight of red flame against the sea, or the sound of men cheering his name. Years later, as emperor, he would often recall that night when he was still young, standing on a hillside with smoke in his lungs and destiny in his eyes. "It was at Toulon," he would say softly, "that I first felt I was truly alive." The siege had not only proven his genius, it had baptized him in purpose. He learned that men could be moved not only by orders but by vision, that courage could be engineered, and that the will of one mind could turn chaos into triumph. In the silence that followed the battle, as dawn spread pale over the harbour, Napoleon stood alone on the ramparts. The city lay beneath him, its houses smoking, its harbour littered with the burning skeletons of ships. The Mediterranean shimmered beyond, cold and infinite. He thought of Corsica, of his mother, of the island winds that had once filled his childhood nights. He thought of the future that stretched now before him, vast, uncertain, irresistible. The sea below whispered, as if echoing his own thought, more. From that moment, more became the rhythm of his life. More command, more challenge, more victory. The boy from Ajaccio had conquered his first city, but he would not stop until he had conquered time itself. And as the sun rose over Toulon, glinting off the spent cannonballs and the bodies of those who had defied him, Napoleon Bonaparte turned away from the smoke and descended the hill. His boots sank into the ash-soft earth, leaving small but deliberate prints that seemed to point toward the horizon. History would follow them, the Italian campaign. The spring of 1796 brought thunder to the valleys of northern Italy, and with it, a young general whose name already stirred whispers through Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, small, intense, and driven by something far deeper than ambition, had been given command of the army of Italy, a neglected and half-starved force that many in Paris regarded as little more than a distraction. Yet to Napoleon, it was an open door. Where others saw ruin, he saw a beginning. The soldiers who gathered under his command were ragged, their uniforms torn, their bellies empty. They had been fighting for ideals that had grown faint in the smoke of revolution. They were cold, unpaid, and weary of promises. When their new commander rode before them, thin, pale, with hollow cheeks and an austere presence, they were uncertain. But then he spoke. His words were not grand or poetic. They were direct, sharp, alive with conviction. He told them they were the brave men of the Republic, destined to march through mountains and history itself. "You are hungry and naked," he reminded them, "but the government owes you much it can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. You will find there honour, glory, and wealth." It was not rhetoric that moved them, but the calm certainty of his tone. He spoke not as one appealing for courage, but as one promising it would come. When he finished, the soldiers cheered until their throats ached. From that moment, the army of Italy was transformed. They moved swiftly, striking like lightning against the Piedmontese forces in the north. Napoleon's strategy was radical for its time. He divided his smaller army to create confusion, attacked at unexpected angles, and concentrated overwhelming force at decisive points. To him, battles were not static clashes, but living equations, problems to be solved with speed and imagination. At Montenotte, Millesimo, and Digo, the Austrians and Piedmontese fell back in shock. Within weeks, the French advanced across the rugged passes of the Ligurian Alps. The soldiers, who had once doubted him, began to believe they were invincible. Napoleon rode among them at dawn and dusk, noting every detail, remembering faces, knowing when to praise and when to push. His presence became a kind of legend. When Piedmont surrendered, Napoleon turned his gaze toward Lombardy and the Austrians who held it. The plains stretched before him like a promise. The French army, lean and fast, swept through the north like a storm. Cities that had stood for centuries under foreign rule now saw the tricolour flag rise above their towers. Milan opened its gates to him. Parma and Modena followed. In every village, the people crowded the streets to see him. To some, he was the liberator who brought the revolution's ideals. To others, the conqueror who demanded their treasure. To Napoleon, it was all one. The advance of France, the proof of destiny. Then came the crossing at Lodi. It was May 1796. The Austrians had retreated beyond the Adda River, defending a narrow bridge with heavy cannon. The French approached under fire. Musket balls tore through their ranks, and men hesitated on the riverbank. The air was thick with smoke and terror. Napoleon, seeing hesitation, seized a flag and advanced himself, shouting for the grenadiers to follow. They did. The French charged across the bridge. Bayonets flashing, drums beating. Cannon fire shredded the planks beneath them. But they pressed on, driving the Austrians back in hand-to-hand combat. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was theirs. That night, as he stood beside the river, watching the current swirl around the timbers soaked with blood and gunpowder, Napoleon felt what he would later call the spark of destiny. Lodi had revealed something to him, that his presence could move thousands, that courage could be summoned by will alone, and that he, Napoleon Bonaparte, could command not just men but history itself. The campaign pressed onward. The French pushed deep into Lombardy, capturing Mantua, Verona, and Brescia. Each victory fed the next. He outmaneuvered his enemies not only through force but through illusion. He spread false rumours, moved troops under cover of night, and struck from impossible directions. To his generals, it seemed he could see battles unfold before they began. The Austrians, desperate, sent new armies from the north. 3 times they tried to relieve Mantua. 3 times Napoleon crushed them. At Rivoli, in the bitter cold of January 1797, he faced forces larger than his own. The enemy came in waves, their drums echoing off the cliffs. Napoleon rode up the hill, calm amid the chaos, and positioned his artillery with surgical precision. The cannon fire tore through the Austrian ranks, scattering them down the slopes. By dusk, the battle was over. More than 14,000 Austrians lay dead or captured. France had won not just a campaign, but a legend. Everywhere, the myth of Napoleon grew. In Paris, newspapers printed his bulletins daily, half report, half prophecy. He wrote them himself, shaping words like weapons, describing victories with poetic grandeur and calculated exaggeration. To the French people, he became a figure of salvation, the embodiment of the Republic's power and glory. His soldiers adored him. They spoke of his uncanny memory, his unbreakable focus, his sleepless energy. He rose before dawn, reviewed positions, inspected rations, planned marches, and then dictated letters until night. He seemed never to tire. In every campfire whisper, he was both man and myth, a general who knew every path, every gun, every soldier. Yet beneath the triumph, his mind was already reaching beyond Italy. He began to imagine Europe as a map of possibilities, nations as pieces to be arranged, borders as lines to be redrawn by reason and will. He saw monarchs not as divine rulers, but as outdated mechanisms. "There will be no peace," he said, "until the old world is remade." But he was also learning politics, the hidden war behind the battlefield. The Directory in Paris watched him with suspicion. His victories made him indispensable, but also dangerous. They feared that the man who could conquer Italy might one day conquer France. Napoleon, aware of their unease, played a careful game. He sent them rich as art, gold, tribute plunder from the conquered territories. Masterpieces from Venice and Milan filled Parisian museums. Wagons of treasure rolled north through the Alps. At the same time, he cultivated loyalty among his troops, ensuring that their devotion was to him before all others. When peace came at last in 1797 with the Treaty of Campo Formio, it was Napoleon who dictated the terms, not the politicians. Austria ceded vast lands. Venice fell under French influence. The map of Europe shifted for the first time in centuries. The Italian campaign had redrawn not only borders, but the imagination of the continent. The boy who once wandered Corsican hills with dreams of empire now commanded armies that spanned nations. Yet he was still restless. Peace, to him, was merely the interval between wars. He once wrote to a confidant, "I am made for the storm. Calm does not suit me." In the wake of his victories, he returned briefly to Milan. Crowds hailed him as a liberator. Artists painted his likeness. Cities renamed streets in his honour. He entered grand halls lined with marble, where diplomats bowed and poets recited verses in his praise. Yet in the midst of celebration he appeared distracted. His eyes wandered to maps, to reports, to the horizon. He had proven his genius beyond doubt, but something deeper now consumed him, a vision of destiny larger than Italy, larger even than France. He had tasted command over nations, and it was not enough. When he returned to Paris, the Directory received him with ceremony but also caution. They awarded him honours, banquets, parades, but behind the applause lay fear. The people adored him more than they trusted the government. In every square his name was whispered with reverence. Napoleon understood that fame, once won, must be wielded like a weapon. He smiled through their ceremonies, bowed at their speeches, and quietly planned his next move. The revolution had given him chaos. Italy had given him order. The next step, he believed, would give him immortality. For now, he returned to his maps and his thoughts, seeing not just battlefields but entire continents as the canvases of his will. The Italian campaign had been his masterpiece, the transformation of a tattered army into a legend, the transformation of a soldier into a myth. But it was also the beginning of an addiction, to triumph, to control, to the strange serenity that came only amid the thunder of guns. In years to come, when the world spoke of Napoleon, it would remember Austerlitz, Jena, and Waterloo. Yet it was in Italy that the rhythm of his destiny began, the cadence of drums echoing through alpine valleys, the flash of banners in sunlight, the young general riding ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon, never looking back. The army of Italy, once a forgotten remnant, had become an unstoppable force. France, once fractured, had found its living symbol. And Napoleon, the Corsican boy who sought belonging, had found his empire's first shape in the dust and glory of those northern plains. In the fading light of one victorious evening, as the soldiers sang and fires crackled across the camp, he walked alone to a nearby ridge. The sky over Lombardy burned crimson. The Po River gleamed like a ribbon of molten gold. He stood still, hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette framed against the horizon. To those who watched from afar, he seemed already more than human, a man balanced perfectly between light and shadow, between destiny and desire. And the night wind, carrying the scent of smoke and spring blossoms, whispered across the plain as if saluting him. He did not smile. He simply gazed forward, calm, composed, already seeing the next campaign unfold before him, far beyond the reach of mortal imagination. Dreams of empire in Egypt. The year was 1798, and the restless heart of Napoleon Bonaparte beat faster with every passing month of peace. The victories in Italy had filled France with his name, but Paris, with its salons and jealous politicians, stifled him. The Directory feared him, admired him, and sought to keep him far from power. Yet Napoleon himself hungered not for rest, nor even for glory alone, but for purpose vast enough to match the contours of his mind. Europe had been conquered once what remained was the world. Across the Mediterranean, a new idea began to take form. Britain ruled the seas and the trade routes to India, the lifeblood of her empire. Strike there, Napoleon reasoned, and France might shatter Britain's hold over the East. But there was something deeper, almost mystical, beneath his plan. He dreamed of an expedition that would blend conquest with discovery, war with enlightenment. Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, the cradle of civilization, the bridge between Africa and Asia, called to him like a whisper from history itself. He proposed the campaign to the Directory as a blow against British commerce, but in truth it was also a theatre for his imagination. Europe is but a molehill, he once remarked. All great glory has come from Asia. He longed to stand where Alexander had stood, to walk among pyramids that had endured longer than empires, to carve his name upon eternity's oldest stone. The preparations began in secret. At Toulon, the same port where his destiny had first revealed itself, a vast armada gathered 13 ships of the line, hundreds of transports, and 38,000 men. Yet this was no ordinary army. Alongside the soldiers, he brought with him 167 of France's greatest scholars, engineers, artists, and astronomers. They would record, measure, and uncover the wonders of the East. It was to be not only a conquest, but a renaissance. In May, the fleet set sail under a sky bright with promise. The Mediterranean stretched before them like a page awaiting ink. Napoleon moved among the decks, speaking little, observing all. The sailors, awed by his composure, called him the man of destiny. To those who asked of the journey's danger, he replied only that the most difficult things are the most glorious. They slipped past the British patrols and landed first at Malta, the fortress island of the Knights of St. John. Within days, it fell. The French tricolour rose over its bastions, and the fleet continued south, the sails gleaming like wings against the blue expanse. On July 1st, 1798, they sighted Egypt. The coast lay silent beneath the burning sun. At dawn, the troops disembarked near Alexandria, their boots sinking into sand instead of soil. The heat was like a furnace. The air shimmered with the mirage of eternity. For the first time, the French army found itself not in Europe's temperate fields, but upon an alien stage, endless desert, blinding sky, and ruins that dwarfed imagination. Napoleon rode through Alexandria, his uniform coated in dust, his expression unreadable. He declared Egypt free from the tyranny of the Mamluks, the ancient warrior caste that ruled in the name of the Ottomans. "People of Egypt," his proclamation read, "you will be told that I come to destroy your religion. Do not believe it. I come to restore your rights, to punish your usurpers." But the Mamluks, fierce horsemen born of centuries of conquest, gathered their forces along the Nile. At their head rode Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, whose cavalry glittered with curved sabres and golden harnesses. They believed the desert itself would devour the Europeans. The two armies met near the village of Mbaba, in sight of the great pyramids of Giza. The French formed their infantry into hollow squares, their cannon bristling from every angle. The Mamluks charged, their horses pounding across the sand, their war cries piercing the wind. Napoleon, standing at the centre of his lines, pointed toward the ancient monuments rising beyond the haze. "Soldiers," he called, his voice steady as iron. "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." The words became immortal. The battle was brief but terrible. The disciplined fire of the French shattered the Mamluk waves. When the smoke cleared, the desert was strewn with their fallen, and the Nile ran dark. The victory was absolute. Egypt lay before him. Cairo surrendered. The French entered the ancient city beneath arches of palm and dust. The minarets shimmered in the sun. The call to prayer mingled with the tramp of boots. For the soldiers it was another conquest. For Napoleon it was a vision made flesh. He moved through the narrow streets, listening to the hum of an ancient civilization still alive beneath centuries of silence. In the weeks that followed, he governed with both curiosity and control. He established the Institut d'Egypte, where his scholars debated beneath the same stars once watched by pharaohs. They studied hieroglyphs, measured pyramids, and mapped the Nile. Their discoveries filled volumes: the Rosetta Stone, the ruins of Thebes, the geometry of temples half buried in sand. To Napoleon, these findings were as valuable as battles. He spoke often of time, of memory, of how nations die but knowledge endures. Yet beyond this enlightenment lay struggle. Disease spread among the troops. The desert devoured supplies. The local population, at first curious, grew restless. The Mamluks regrouped in the south, and British warships hunted the French fleet. Then came disaster. On August 1st, at Aboukir Bay, Admiral Nelson found the anchored French fleet and unleashed destruction. In a single night of fire and thunder, the ships were annihilated. The sea burned red and gold as explosions lit the horizon. When dawn came, the Mediterranean belonged once more to Britain. Napoleon and his army were trapped in Egypt. For most men, it would have been the end. For Napoleon, it was a new beginning. He refused despair. "We must rely only upon ourselves," he told his generals. He reorganized the army, struck south towards Syria, and besieged the fortress of Acre. The campaign was brutal. Plague stalked the ranks, and the Ottoman defence was unyielding. After weeks of suffering, he withdrew, his dream of eastern conquest fading like mirage heat. But even in retreat, he found meaning. He studied the stars over the desert, read the Quran, and wrote reflections on destiny and civilization. In those nights of sand and silence, his thoughts turned inward. He saw himself as part of a continuum, the successor of Alexander, Caesar, and the pharaohs. History, he believed, was a single unbroken thread, and he was its latest knot. When word reached him that France was again in turmoil, his decision was instant. He would return. Leaving his army behind, he boarded a small ship with a handful of companions. The Mediterranean was swarming with British vessels, but fortune favoured him. Through storms and silence, he crossed the sea unseen, as if history itself shielded his passage. In October 1799, he landed on the French coast. France was broken once more, its government corrupt, its armies faltering, its people disillusioned. He arrived like a ghost of salvation, his legend preceding him. Crowds gathered wherever he passed, cheering the conqueror of Italy, the victor of the pyramids. They saw in him not merely a general, but a symbol, a man who could impose order upon chaos. Within weeks, he moved against the failing Directory. The coup of Brumaire unfolded like one of his campaigns, swift, decisive, inevitable. Surrounded by loyal troops, he dispersed the governing councils and declared a new order, the consulate. He was First Consul of France. The revolution, once a whirlwind of liberty, now had found its master. Egypt had given him more than victories. It had given him vision. He had touched the sands of antiquity, looked upon ruins that whispered of the eternity of power and the inevitability of its decay. Yet rather than humility, the lesson had filled him with conviction. He believed himself chosen, a figure meant not just to rule but to endure. From that point forward, Napoleon was no longer a man of France alone. He was a man of the ages, his imagination forever stretching beyond the boundaries of his empire, beyond even the reach of mortality. In years to come, when the world spoke his name, they would remember the thunder of his battles, the glint of his crown, but he himself would remember Egypt, the blinding sun, the shadows of pyramids, the silence of the desert. It was there that he first measured himself against time itself, and dared to believe he might one day conquer it. The empire he would build had already begun in the mind of a man who had looked upon the ancient sands and seen his reflection in their endless golden expanse. The coup of Brumaire, the ship that bore Napoleon Bonaparte back to France in the autumn of 1799, cut through grey seas and rough winds, carrying not just a general returning from a distant campaign, but a force about to reshape the world. When he stepped ashore at Fréjus, the crowd surged forward, shouting his name. News of Egypt's mysteries and victories had reached home before him, magnified by rumour and longing. He was no longer merely the hero of Italy, he was the legend of two continents, a living symbol of destiny itself. Yet the France he returned to was fragile. The revolution's fever had cooled into exhaustion. The Directory, that five-headed government of compromise and corruption, was collapsing under its own weight. Inflation spread, armies went unpaid, and the streets murmured with despair. The ideals of liberty and fraternity, once chanted in the squares, had become hollow echoes among bureaucrats and profiteers. France had won battles but lost its soul. Napoleon saw opportunity in ruin. He had left France as a general. He returned as a saviour in waiting. He understood what the people craved, order, stability, and a figure strong enough to deliver both. In his silence and composure, they sensed a certainty that none of their politicians could offer. In Paris, he was greeted by the remnants of the Directory, who smiled through clenched teeth. To their eyes, he was both necessary and dangerous. They needed him to save the Republic, but feared he might seize it instead. They were right to fear. Within weeks, he began to weave his plan. He met with two key figures, Emmanuel Sieyès, a cunning statesman who had long plotted a new constitution, and his brother Lucien Bonaparte, the ambitious president of the Council of 500. They agreed that the Republic could not survive without decisive change. But where Sieyès imagined a government guided by laws, Napoleon envisioned one ruled by will. The conspiracy took form beneath the glittering surface of Parisian calm. Letters were written in code, orders whispered to loyal officers. Napoleon moved through salons and corridors like a shadow, all charm and restraint, while his allies prepared the machinery of a quiet coup. The moment came in November, known in the revolutionary calendar as the 18th Brumaire, Year 8. Under pretext of a royalist uprising, troops were summoned to protect the government. At dawn, soldiers filled the streets, their bayonets gleaming in the cold light. The councils of government were ordered to relocate to Saint-Cloud, outside Paris, ostensibly for safety. In truth, it was isolation. Napoleon arrived there at noon, surrounded by his generals Murat, Lannes, Lefebvre, men who would follow him into any storm. He entered the chamber of the Council of Ancients, tall boots muddy from the ride, his face pale but resolute. He spoke with the calm of inevitability. "Citizens," he said, "the Republic is in peril. You have sought my aid. I offer it." The words were smooth, deliberate, almost hypnotic. The ancients, weary of chaos, approved the transfer of power. But in the adjoining chamber, the Council of 500 reacted with fury. Cries of treason filled the air as members leapt from their benches. Napoleon entered, attempting to speak, but the roar drowned him. Hands reached for his uniform. Some drew knives. For a moment, the man who had faced cannon and cavalry stood surrounded by legislators, their rage greater than gunfire. Outside, his brother Lucien, sensing danger, ordered the guards to intervene. The soldiers stormed in, clearing the hall at bayonet point. The assembly scattered into the gardens, the shouts fading into the wind. By nightfall, the Directory was no more. The Republic had fallen not by revolution, but by precision. The next morning, France awoke to silence. There were no barricades, no executions, no blood upon the cobblestones. Power had changed hands with surgical efficiency. Napoleon's name now stood at the head of the new government. The consulate was born, with 3 consuls sharing authority, but everyone knew where the true power lay. He was First Consul of France, master in all but title. In the following days, he set about restoring order. The streets of Paris filled with soldiers and clerks, but no mobs. Bread returned to the markets, wages to the barracks. The newspapers, once wild with faction, now carried only calm proclamations. To the people, it seemed that at last the revolution had found its direction. Napoleon moved into the Luxembourg Palace, where sunlight filtered through the high windows onto maps and documents that covered his desk. He worked without rest, drafting decrees, correcting drafts, shaping the framework of government with mathematical precision. The ministers who came before him found him neither impatient nor cruel, but terrifyingly efficient. His gaze, steady and unblinking, seemed to pierce through excuses and hesitation alike. "France," he once said to his secretaries, "is an idea before it is a nation. We will give that idea form." He rebuilt the administration, appointing prefects to govern provinces with military discipline. He reformed taxation, created a central bank, and revived public works. Roads were repaired, canals restored, bridges built. The rhythm of stability returned, and the people, tired of ideals, hungry for peace, began to adore him. Beyond the Seine, however, the old monarchies of Europe watched with alarm. Austria, Britain, and Russia formed a new coalition to strangle the reborn France. But Napoleon, even amid politics, remained a soldier. "I shall astonish them," he murmured, studying the map of Italy once more. Within months, he was in the saddle again, leading his army through the Alpine passes, the peaks shrouded in snow. At Marengo, he met the Austrians in battle. For most of the day, the French were driven back. Defeat seemed certain. Then, as dusk descended, Napoleon summoned his reserves. "One strong blow," he said to his generals, "and the day is ours." They struck. The tide turned. When the smoke cleared, the enemy fled, and the tricolour flew once again over northern Italy. The victory sealed his rule. France rejoiced, Europe trembled. The newspapers carried his name on every page. Painters immortalized him crossing the Alps, calm atop a rearing steed. Myth and man fused into one. But beneath the triumph lay design. Napoleon understood that military glory was not enough. To endure, power must be clothed in legitimacy. The revolution had destroyed kings and priests. He would reconcile both to his purpose. In 1801, he negotiated peace with Austria and then Britain, ending years of war. He signed the Concordat with the Pope, restoring religion to France while keeping it under his control. Churches reopened, bells rang once more, and even the devout began to see in him the hand of Providence. Within the palaces of Paris, portraits of Napoleon replaced those of saints. The people did not mind. To them, he was deliverance, discipline without cruelty, order without tyranny. He was not the return of monarchy, they told themselves, but its reinvention. He declined the title of king, yet his power surpassed any monarch's. Ministers bowed before his decisions, generals trembled at his disapproval, and even foreign ambassadors felt the gravity of his silence. He was both ruler and idea, the embodiment of stability, after a decade of chaos. In the evenings, when work finally paused, he would walk alone through the gardens of the Tuileries, hands clasped behind his back. The lamps glowed through the fog, the fountains whispered beneath the stars. Paris lay quiet, obedient, rebuilt in his image. And he, the once poor Corsican cadet, now governed the nation that had scorned his accent and his birth. Yet even in the stillness, he was not content. Peace was never enough for him. It was merely a waiting room for destiny. He knew that the crown of France hovered near, waiting for a head bold enough to seize it. The revolution had proclaimed that no man should rise above the law, yet in him the people saw the law made flesh. He had conquered the Republic not by destroying it, but by perfecting it into submission. The coup of Brumaire had been bloodless, but its impact was seismic. It marked the end of the revolution's chaos and the birth of a new order, an empire in all but name. The nation that once overthrew kings now built palaces for its general. And as the winter of 1799 turned to spring, and France found itself once more at peace, Napoleon looked toward the horizon, where the dawn glowed faintly over the Seine. "France is quiet," an aide remarked. "Quiet?" Napoleon said softly, his eyes fixed on the light. "No, it is waiting." And so it was. Waiting for the moment when the soldier would become emperor, when the dream of control would harden into empire, when the calm after the revolution would give way to the sound of drums once more. The stage was set. The tide of history had turned its gaze upon one man, the birth of the empire. The dawn of the 2nd of December, 1804, broke cold and grey over Paris, but within the ancient walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, the air shimmered with anticipation. The bells rang as they had not rung since the crowning of kings, echoing across the Seine, through streets hung with tricolour banners and garlands of gold. A new emperor was to be crowned that day, not by inheritance or divine right, but by the force of will. France, weary of revolution and chaos, had found in one man both its conqueror and its redeemer. The Republic had been born in the blood of kings. Now it would rebirth monarchy in the image of a soldier. Napoleon Bonaparte, dressed in robes of crimson velvet trimmed with ermine, stood before the altar beneath the vast Gothic arches. His mother, Letizia, watched from a high gallery, her face unreadable. The Pope himself, Pius VII, had been summoned from Rome to sanctify the moment, though all of Europe whispered that he was but a guest in another man's empire. The music swelled. Horns, organs, choirs, the sound of history remade. When the moment came, the Pope lifted the crown of gold and laurel and turned toward him, ready to place it upon his head. But Napoleon stepped forward, took it from the pontiff's trembling hands and placed it on his own brow. Gasps rippled through the cathedral. It was a gesture older than rebellion and deeper than pride. It declared that his authority came not from heaven or tradition, but from himself. Then, turning to Josephine, he set a second crown upon her head, her eyes shining with tears. Thus was born the Empire of the French. Outside, cannons thundered across the city, their echoes rolling down the river like the voice of destiny itself. The crowds filled the squares, cheering the man who had brought them peace, prosperity, and pride. Few among them questioned the transformation of republic into empire. They cared only that the bread was fresh, the streets safe, and the flag victorious. Napoleon returned to the Tuileries that night through streets glittering with torches. As he stepped into the silence of his chamber, the weight of the golden crown gone, he looked into a mirror and studied his reflection. The face was pale, the eyes fierce, the expression calm as carved marble. He had achieved what no general in memory had dared. He had made himself emperor, not by birth but by merit, by audacity, by belief. He had not restored the old monarchy, he had replaced it. The next morning, the machinery of empire began to move. Ministers, prefects, marshals and senators filled the halls. Titles once abolished by revolution were revived, but reshaped. Nobility would no longer be inherited by ancient blood, but earned through service, loyalty, and brilliance. His marshals, men of humble origins, peasants, cobblers, blacksmiths, now wore golden epaulets and bore the titles of dukes and princes. They were the new aristocracy of courage. The emperor himself worked without pause. At dawn, he was at his desk. By nightfall, he had dictated dozens of letters, reviewed maps, signed decrees. He knew every detail of his empire, the harvests in Normandy, the fortifications at Antwerp, the roads through the Alps. To his secretaries, it seemed that no corner of France escaped his mind. He built monuments not merely to commemorate victories, but to instruct the people in greatness. The Arc de Triomphe was conceived, the Legion of Honour founded, the Louvre filled with the plundered glories of Europe. Every triumph, every marble facade, every banner carried the same message: France is eternal, and I am its instrument. Yet beyond these outward displays, Napoleon's true empire was one of law and administration. The Napoleonic Code, completed in 1804, transformed not only France but much of the modern world. It established equality before the law, protected property, and replaced feudal privilege with order and reason. My true glory, he would later say, is not to have won 40 battles, but to have created the civil code. That will live forever. Still, his mind was restless. Empire to him was not a state of being but a motion, a ceaseless expansion, a challenge to destiny itself. Peace, though signed with Austria and Britain, was to him an illusion. The monarchs of Europe viewed him not as a peer, but as a usurper, a commoner wearing Caesar's mantle. They would never rest until he was overthrown, and he would never rest until they bowed before him. In 1805, sensing the gathering storm, he assembled the Grande Armée at Boulogne, 200,000 soldiers drilled to perfection, the most disciplined fighting force the world had ever seen. Their camps stretched across the northern coast, the air alive with music, marches, and the rhythm of endless preparation. Each man believed he was part of something larger than history, a living machine of destiny forged in the name of France and of one man. When the third coalition of Britain, Austria, and Russia finally moved against him, Napoleon did not hesitate. In a single dazzling manoeuvre, he turned his army from the Channel toward the heart of Europe. His march across the Rhine was a work of art, silent, swift, unstoppable. Vienna fell without a fight. The Austrians fled east to join the Russians, and in December, the two Allied armies met him near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. The morning of the battle was shrouded in fog. Napoleon studied the field from a hill, noting the high ground where the enemy stood. His officers urged caution. He smiled faintly. "We will lure them down," he said, "and then strike like the sun through the mist." When the fog lifted, His plan unfolded with mathematical precision. His centre feigned weakness. The Allies advanced into the trap. At that moment, the French reserves, hidden in the mist, crashed into their flank. The plain erupted in thunder and smoke. For 6 hours, the world trembled. By dusk, the Allied army was broken, the sun reflecting off the frozen ponds where men and horses drowned beneath the ice. Austerlitz was his masterpiece, the battle that sealed his legend. The Emperor of the French had defeated the combined might of Europe in a single day. When he rode across the field afterward, even his enemies bowed their heads in awe. The Tsar of Russia fled, the Emperor of Austria sued for peace, and across the continent, monarchs whispered his name with dread. In Paris, news of the victory turned to worship. Bells rang for 3 days. Poets hailed him as the new Alexander. Mothers taught their children his victories as if they were scripture. From Spain to Poland, his empire stretched like a golden arch over Europe. Yet even in triumph, his eyes never softened. He moved from victory to victory, rearranging kingdoms as easily as a player moves pieces on a chessboard. He crowned new kings, his brothers and generals across the lands he conquered. Naples, Holland, Westphalia, all ruled by Bonapartes. Europe was being remade in his family's image. And still he worked. He negotiated treaties, inspected barracks, wrote laws, planned cities. His ministers called him tireless, his enemies inhuman. Sleep came in brief intervals. Meals were taken in minutes. He dictated letters to 4 secretaries at once, his mind leaping between diplomacy, logistics, and design. To those near him, he seemed less a man than an elemental force. Yet behind the marble facade, shadows lengthened. Josephine, his empress, adored him but grew anxious. Her charm still captivated the salons, but her inability to bear him a son haunted their marriage. Courtiers whispered of her fading influence, of the emperor's glances toward younger women. Napoleon loved her still, but ambition had always outranked affection in his heart. In the evenings, when the palace was silent, he would sometimes pace the long corridors alone. The marble floors reflected the flicker of candlelight. Portraits of Caesar, Charlemagne, and Alexander lined the walls. He would pause before them, as though measuring himself against their gaze. They had ruled the world and fallen. He wondered fleetingly whether they too had felt this chill of foreknowledge beneath their crowns. But such thoughts never lingered. He turned from them as he turned from every doubt with will alone. To falter was to yield, and yielding had never been part of his design. By 1806, his empire was at its height. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year relic, was dissolved by his hand. From Lisbon to Warsaw, his laws, his coins, his banners spread. In every capital, statues were raised in his honour, and the word Napoleon came to mean both conqueror and order. He had remade France and with it, Europe. But like the ancient empires he admired, his creation rested upon unrelenting motion. To stand still was to fall, and so, though peace lay before him, he turned once more toward war, driven not by need but by the inner compulsion of destiny itself. The birth of the empire had fulfilled the dream of power, yet it also planted the seed of its ruin. For even as he crowned himself, the world began to gather its resistance, and the tide that had risen with such brilliance would one day turn with equal force. For now, though, the eagle soared. The music of triumph echoed from the palaces of Paris to the battlefields of Europe, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of one man's footsteps continued measured, inevitable, echoing down the marble halls of history, the code and the reformer. The drums of war often thundered in Napoleon's world, but behind those drums worked a quieter mind, one obsessed not only with conquest but with creation. To him, empire was not merely a tapestry of battles, it was a system, an architecture of civilization. In the still hours between campaigns, while the maps of Europe still glowed with the fire of victory, Napoleon turned inward, determined to construct the foundations of a France that would outlast him. Paris, now the centre of his empire, hummed with the machinery of his vision. Clerks and jurists filled the ministries. Engineers surveyed roads and bridges. The banks counted new coin minted under the imperial seal. Soldiers still marched, but behind them rose schools, courts, and laws. He believed that a nation, like an army, must be disciplined, rational, and precise, and that chaos could be conquered as surely as a battlefield. Among his many projects, one towered above all, the Code Civil des Français, soon to be known to history as the Napoleonic Code. France had lived for centuries under a patchwork of feudal customs and regional laws, remnants of monarchies and manners. The revolution had shattered that old order, but left nothing stable in its place. Justice varied from province to province, often bending to corruption and local power. Napoleon saw in this confusion not merely inefficiency, but weakness. He gathered the finest legal minds of France, Tronchet, Portalis, Bigot de Préameneu, and Malaville, 4 men who had survived the storms of revolution with intellects as sharp as their caution. He presided over their meetings personally, his chair placed at the head of the table like that of a general before his staff. Each clause, each phrase, was discussed beneath his gaze. When disputes arose, he cut through them with simplicity. "Explain it to me," he would demand, as if I were a man of no letters. "If I do not understand it, neither will the nation." Day after day, the discussions stretched into the night. By candlelight, in rooms heavy with ink and parchment, the architecture of modern law took shape. The principles were revolutionary in their clarity: equality before the law, freedom of religion, the sanctity of property, the abolition of privileges based on birth. Yet beneath these ideals lay Napoleon's instinct for order. Authority, family, and discipline were its pillars. The father was the head of the household, the state, the guardian of society. Liberty was permitted, but only within the boundaries of reason. When the code was completed in 1804, Napoleon read its pages with satisfaction. "This," he said softly, "is the work that will endure." He was right. Long after his battles faded into legend, his laws would remain, influencing nations from Italy to Latin America, from Belgium to Egypt. The sword had built an empire, but the pen would preserve it. His reforms did not stop there. He reorganized the education system, creating the lycée schools that would produce generations of disciplined minds molded to serve the state. Teachers were chosen with care. Students were drilled in logic, mathematics, and loyalty. "Give me 10 years, he once remarked, "and I will create a generation for France." He believed that knowledge was power, but power must serve unity. The universities were brought under imperial control. The church's influence within them was curbed. Religion, to Napoleon, was a tool of social harmony, not a master of conscience. "Society without religion is like a ship without a compass," he once told his ministers, "but I am the helmsman." He also revived France's economy. The Bank of France, established under his rule, stabilized currency and restored faith in trade. Roads and canals spread like veins across the country, carrying the lifeblood of commerce from the cities to the countryside. The great roads radiated outward from Paris, as if from the heart of the empire itself, a geometry of order traced upon the land. Even the arts were bent to his purpose. The Louvre became the Musée Napoléon, filled with treasures gathered from his conquests. The winged victory of Samothrace, the spoils of Venice, the paintings of Titian and Raphael. He did not see them as plunder, but as inheritance symbols of civilization reclaimed. Sculptors and painters portrayed him as a new Caesar, a man cast in marble before his body was even cold. He reimagined Paris itself. The city became a stage for empire. Wide boulevards, triumphal arches, statues, and squares aligned to the rhythm of power. He ordered fountains for beauty, street lamps for safety, and bridges for unity. Each stone laid was an echo of his name. He meant to leave nothing undone, nothing ungoverned. And yet, beneath this vision of perfection, there were shadows. His rule was efficient, but it was also absolute. The press was muzzled, dissent silenced, critics exiled. Spies filled the cafes and salons, listening for treason in idle talk. Freedom, that flame of the revolution, burned now behind glass contained, controlled, made to illuminate rather than ignite. But to the people, the trade seemed fair. For the first time in decades, their children were fed, their fields protected, their roads safe. Merchants prospered, farmers flourished. The France of constant revolutions had given way to a France of stability and pride. In the villages, peasants hung portraits of the emperor beside those of the Virgin Mary, murmuring his name in the same prayers. Beyond the borders, the old monarchies watched in dread. To them, Napoleon's reforms were as dangerous as his armies. His ideas marched faster than his soldiers, slipping into the minds of the oppressed across Europe. In the salons of Berlin, the taverns of Warsaw, the academies of Vienna, young men whispered of equality and merit, of a world ruled by reason rather than birth. Kings saw not only defeat on the battlefield, but rebellion in the hearts of their own subjects. Meanwhile, within his palace, Napoleon's personal life began to fray. Josephine, beloved yet barren, wept quietly as whispers of divorce grew louder. She had been his partner in youth, his charm in triumph, but now, as the empire expanded, so too did his need for an heir. In the marble halls of the Tuileries, she waited like a ghost of the past, her eyes following him as he passed from room to room, his mind already beyond her. He was changing. The general who had once laughed with soldiers around campfires had become a figure of ceremony. The warmth of his humanity cooled beneath the weight of crown and empire. Those closest to him felt at first the distance, the impatience, the relentless precision of his will. In 1806, when the Prussian army dared to challenge him, he left his papers, his maps, his laws, and returned to the field. At Jena and Auerstedt, his armies shattered the might of Frederick's heirs in a single day. The philosopher Hegel, watching the emperor ride through the streets of Jena, wrote that he had seen the world's spirit on horseback. Napoleon himself scarcely smiled. Victory was expected, almost mathematical. His mind, once a forge of dreams, had become a machine of control. Yet he still spoke of his mission as if divine, to bring the light of reason to Europe. In his proclamations, he described himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, spreading law where there had been privilege, progress where there had been decay. He saw no contradiction between his ideals and his authority. Men are moved by two levers, he said, fear and self-interest. I use both for the good of France. At home, the reforms continued. The calendar returned to Christian reckoning, the church restored but obedient. Civil service positions were earned through merit, not birth. Meritocracy became his creed, yet loyalty remained its hidden currency. And always the code spread farther. It reached Belgium, Holland, Italy, and beyond the Rhine. Judges, mayors, and merchants recited its articles like scripture. It was the silent empire, no soldiers, no cannons, just the steady rhythm of order. By 1807, as France glittered in prosperity, Napoleon could look upon his creation and see a kind of perfection, an empire of discipline, reason, and law. Yet even as he built, he was already planning his next campaign. For him, creation and conquest were inseparable. Peace was merely preparation for motion. He had conquered France with clarity, Europe with genius, and the imagination of mankind with will. But his eyes, always searching the horizon, now turned toward the last unbroken bastion of defiance, Britain. The battle of ideas would become a battle of economies and seas. The emperor had remade the structure of the modern world, but in doing so, he had chained his own spirit to the relentless pursuit of order. The builder and the conqueror were one, and neither knew how to stop. The wars of Europe. By the beginning of 1808, Europe no longer breathed without Napoleon's rhythm. His armies moved like tides across the continent, disciplined, inevitable, silent until they struck. He had subdued Italy, humbled Austria, broken Prussia, and drawn new borders with a stroke of his pen. Yet peace remained an illusion, for where others saw empire, he saw unfinished work. The very vastness of his success demanded constant motion. Stillness to him was death. The crowned heads of Europe had bent their knees, but their hearts smouldered with resentment. The royal courts whispered, planned, and prayed that the tide might turn. Britain stood defiant across the Channel, unassailable behind her navy. Russia watched from the east, biding its time. Spain simmered under his influence but refused to yield its soul. And within Napoleon himself, the fire of destiny burned brighter, urging him onward. His empire, though draped in glory, rested on fragile pillars: obedience, fear, and faith in his genius. His enemies understood this better than he did. They waited for the moment when the weight of his ambition would exceed even his strength. But for now, he stood at the height of his power, the master of a continent that stretched from Lisbon to Warsaw. The wars of Europe were not only wars of armies, they were wars of systems. Old monarchies fought for tradition, Napoleon fought for order. His troops carried not just muskets but the code, the promise of equality, the architecture of reason. Wherever his eagles flew, old privileges fell. In the eyes of some, he was a liberator. In others, the greatest tyrant since Rome. In 1805, after the triumph of Austerlitz, he had forced Austria into submission. In 1806, he crushed Prussia, scattering its proud armies like leaves before the wind. The victories at Jena and Auerstedt ended a kingdom's arrogance in a single day. The streets of Berlin echoed with the tramp of French boots, and the statue of Frederick the Great seemed to bow in silence as Napoleon stood before it. "If he were alive," Napoleon murmured, "we would not be here." The Prussian monarchy survived only by his mercy. Its lands were carved, its treasures sent to Paris, its pride left in ashes. Yet Napoleon did not destroy it, was not his way. He rebuilt what he conquered, reorganized states, drafted constitutions, and installed rulers loyal to him. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the Holy Roman Empire, dissolving 1,000 years of feudal relics in a single decree. He had done what centuries of kings had failed to do. He had unified Germany not as a nation, but as an obedient frontier of France. In Poland, he found new allies among a people long divided and enslaved by their neighbours. They greeted him as a messiah, hailing him as the liberator who would restore their homeland. The Duchy of Warsaw was born under his protection, a fragile dream carried in the folds of his banners. For the Poles, Napoleon was not merely a conqueror, but a resurrection. They sang of him in the streets, painted his image on icons, prayed for his victories as if for divine intervention. But each victory demanded another. Each new crown placed upon a client king's head only fed his hunger for more. By 1807, he stood upon the frozen plains of Eylau, facing the Russian army amid blizzards that turned the world white. The battle raged for 2 days in snow and blood. Men froze where they fell. The wind carried cries into the endless sky. Napoleon, standing amid the storm, looked out across a field of death and saw something he had not known before doubt. Victory came, but it was hollow, costly, stained with the suffering of tens of thousands. Even his veterans looked away from him that night, their faces pale in the firelight. For the first time, glory seemed cold. Yet when spring returned, so did his will. At Friedland he struck again, swift and precise, and the Russians broke before his might. The Tsar, Alexander I, requested a meeting. They met upon a raft anchored in the centre of the Niemen River, the waters still carrying the reflection of two empires. Napoleon, dressed in simple uniform, spoke with warmth and vision. He admired Alexander's youth, his charm, his curiosity for reform. The two men, so different yet so alike in pride, found an accord. On that raft, they divided the world as if it were a map of destiny. France would dominate the West, Russia, the East. The Treaty of Tilsit ended the war and sealed their uneasy friendship. When the French emperor returned to Paris, the city erupted in celebration. Bells pealed, crowds cheered, and the streets glittered with triumphal arches of laurel and silk. Europe, it seemed, lay at his feet. But Napoleon was not deceived by peace. He saw in it only a pause, a breath before the next storm. He turned his attention to Britain, the last great rival. The French navy could not match its fleets, so he conceived a different war, a war of economy, isolation, and endurance. Through the continental system, he sought to blockade the British Isles, cutting them off from trade with the rest of Europe. All ports under his control were closed to British goods. All nations within his orbit were forced to comply. It was a vast experiment in global warfare, a battle fought with tariffs and embargoes instead of cannon. At first, it weakened Britain's commerce, but soon the strain spread through Europe itself. Merchants complained, ports withered, and black markets thrived. The system demanded total obedience, and not every ally obeyed. Portugal, tied to Britain by ancient friendship, defied the order. Napoleon reacted as always with invasion. In 1807 his troops marched into Spain and crossed into Portugal, occupying Lisbon within weeks. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, and for the first time the French flag flew on the Atlantic's farthest shore. But Spain was not Portugal. Spain had its own fire, its own pride, its own centuries-old soul. Napoleon, seeking to secure his control, removed its king and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people rose in fury. From the mountains and villages came the cry of rebellion, the first guerrilla war of the modern age. Peasants armed with knives and muskets struck from the shadows, ambushed convoys, vanished into the hills. The French, trained for battlefields, now faced an enemy without front or flag. The land itself seemed to revolt. Priests preached resistance from the pulpits, women smuggled ammunition beneath their shawls, children acted as spies. Every road, every forest became a trap. Napoleon called it the Spanish Ulcer, a wound that would never heal. To crush the uprising, he sent reinforcements, even travelling there himself in 1808 to restore order. Madrid fell, but peace did not follow. The British Army, under a new commander, Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and began to push back. The Peninsular War would drain France's strength for 6 years, consuming men and treasure like fire devours dry wood. Meanwhile, in the north, the empire still expanded. Holland became a kingdom under his brother Louis. The German states remained loyal, if unwillingly. Italy flourished under his stepson Eugene. Europe had never known such unity, such power under one mind. Yet it was unity imposed by will, not consent, and beneath it ran a growing tremor of rebellion. The emperor's victories had made him adored by his soldiers but feared by his people. His laws had brought order, but his taxes and conscriptions bred resentment. Mothers wept as sons were sent to distant wars. Fathers bowed their heads at the sound of marching drums. The empire, once a promise of peace, had become a machine of endless conquest. Still, Napoleon believed himself invincible. In 1809, when Austria rose again, he crushed it at Wagram, near Vienna, in one of the bloodiest battles of his career. He entered the conquered capital a second time, this time with an air of fatigue rather than triumph. His letters to Paris were curt, his tone colder. The victories no longer thrilled him, they were expected, inevitable, almost mechanical. In the aftermath, he made a decision that revealed both his pragmatism and his pride. He divorced Josephine, weeping privately as he did so, and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, a union meant to bind the old dynasties to his new empire. When their son, the King of Rome, was born, Napoleon held the child in his arms and whispered, "This is the heir of my name, my blood, and my destiny." For the first time, he believed his dynasty eternal. But even as he cradled his son, the storm clouds thickened. The Peninsular War bled him daily. The continental system strained his allies, and in the east, Russia began to resist his decrees. The friendship of Tilsit had cooled into suspicion. Alexander resented the blockade's grip on his trade and the arrogance of French domination. Europe, momentarily silenced, was beginning to stir once more. The kings who had once knelt were rising again, slowly, carefully, waiting for the moment when the tide would turn. Napoleon's empire stood immense, glittering, and magnificent, but its edges trembled. The wars of Europe had crowned him master of the age, yet the same wars had made him their prisoner. His genius, which had conquered the continent, now bound him to its defence. The emperor who had reshaped nations would soon confront his greatest adversary, not a coalition of kings, but the limits of his own reach. And in the distance, across the forests and frozen rivers of the east, the vast shadow of Russia waited, the continental dream. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the summit of earthly power. His empire stretched like a living map from the Atlantic to the Niemen River, from the frozen North Sea to the golden plains of Italy. He had crowned himself emperor, shattered every coalition sent against him, and carved Europe into his image. Kings bowed at his command. Nations obeyed the rhythm of his armies. Yet for all his victories, one empire still defied him, the British. And it was that defiance, distant and enduring, that would lure him toward his greatest gamble and the beginning of his fall. Britain, protected by the sea and ruled by commerce, had become the beating heart of resistance. Napoleon, master of land, was powerless before her fleets. He had watched his navy burn at Trafalgar 5 years before. The dream of invasion turned to smoke on the horizon. Since that day, he had resolved to wage war not with ships, but with trade, believing that economics could achieve what cannon could not. Thus was born his grand design, the continental system. It was, in essence, an empire-wide blockade. Every port under his control was to close to British goods. Every ally, every subject state was forbidden to trade with the island nation. The wealth of Britain, Napoleon reasoned, depended on its exports and colonies. Starve its trade, and its empire would collapse from within. "We will conquer England," he declared, "on the battlefield of industry." The decree spread like an edict from Olympus. In Amsterdam, Hamburg, Milan, and Warsaw, customs houses sealed their harbours. French officials enforced the embargo with zeal. Inspectors searched ships, warehouses, and even private homes. Napoleon imagined himself as the architect of a new global order, one united under his rule, free from British influence, self-sufficient and loyal. At first, the results dazzled him. British exports plummeted, merchants despaired. Continental goods rose in value, and Paris gleamed with the satisfaction of economic conquest. But cracks appeared quickly. Smugglers thrived. Neutral nations like Sweden and Portugal quietly ignored the decree. Even Napoleon's allies found ways around it, bribing officials, trading through secret ports, or falsifying records. The system required obedience beyond even his control. It demanded that Europe's heart beat only to France's command, and Europe's heart refused. The strain of enforcement bred resentment. The middle classes, once enriched by commerce, suffered. Farmers lost markets, merchants lost ships, and cities grew restless. The very people who had once cheered the emperor's name now whispered curses in secret. Napoleon's pride refused to bend. He expanded the system, tightening it like a noose. When Portugal defied him, he invaded it. When Spain resisted his brother's rule, he sent more troops. The Peninsular War became a nightmare, a wound that drained the empire of men and morale. Across the rugged hills, Spanish guerrillas struck and vanished like ghosts. French columns marched endlessly, capturing towns that would rise again the moment they left. The emperor's marshals begged him to withdraw, but he would not hear of it. His will had conquered kingdoms. It could surely conquer rebellion. Yet Spain was not a nation of palaces and armies. It was a nation of churches, mountains, and stubborn hearts. For the first time, Napoleon faced not an army, but a people who refused to be ruled. Meanwhile, in the far north and east, other allies began to waver. The continental system strangled economies beyond repair. Denmark, once prosperous, withered under the blockade. Prussia and Austria, now nominal allies, chafed under French demands. But the most dangerous defection of all came from Russia. Tsar Alexander I had signed the Treaty of Tilsit in good faith, or at least in fear. For a time, he had admired Napoleon's energy, even envied his order. But the continental system crippled Russia's trade. British ships still carried her grain, her furs, her timber. When Napoleon ordered him to cut those ties, the Tsar hesitated, then quietly ignored the decree. To Napoleon, this was betrayal. To Alexander, it was survival. Between them stretched not just miles, but pride, two rulers too powerful to share the same continent. Napoleon's vision of a unified Europe began to fracture. He had built it upon command, not consent. The kings he had raised his brothers. His generals served him out of fear or ambition, not devotion. Louis in Holland tried to rule kindly. Napoleon replaced him. Joseph in Spain ruled in misery, surrounded by blood and rebellion. "My family," Napoleon once said bitterly, "is my worst enemy." Still, his ambition refused rest. He turned his fury against Russia, determined to enforce obedience once more. "The Tsar has broken faith," he told his council in 1811. "We will march to Moscow. One blow will bring him to his knees." His ministers pleaded with him to reconsider. Even his wife, Marie-Louise, begged for caution. He silenced them with a glance. "I have conquered Europe," he said, "and I will conquer peace." Preparations for invasion began at once. The scale was beyond anything the world had seen. From every corner of Europe came soldiers, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutchmen, Spaniards, all gathered under the imperial eagle. More than 600,000 men assembled along the Niemen River in the summer of 1812. They were not an army, they were a civilization in motion. Napoleon watched them from his tent, his face lit by lamplight as he studied the maps. "The campaign will be short," he told his generals. "One decisive victory, and the Tsar will yield." He believed it as he believed all things his will conceived. But beneath the banners and drums there was unease. The veterans remembered the snows of Eylau, the bitter cold of Poland. They knew the vastness of Russia, the cruelty of its winters. Yet they marched, for his presence was enough to erase fear. Before crossing the Niemen, Napoleon paused. The river shimmered beneath the dawn, wide and still. He stood in silence, then murmured, "The die is cast." It was a phrase spoken by Caesar at the Rubicon, and like Caesar, he was crossing into fate. Behind him lay a Europe exhausted by his brilliance. Ahead, a land vast enough to absorb even his legend. The continental dream, the vision of a Europe united under reason, order, and empire had begun to decay. Its boundaries were stretched too far, its foundations too brittle. Yet Napoleon, blinded by the scale of his past triumphs, could not see the fault lines beneath his creation. He imagined himself as a new Alexander, marching east to compel submission by awe alone. The reality that awaited him was something far colder and older than any empire. Russia's immensity, its silence, its winter. The British blockade still stood. The Spanish resistance still burned. His allies still plotted. Yet Napoleon, undeterred, pressed onward, believing that destiny, once conquered, could never betray him. The drums of the Grande Armée rolled across the river. The fields trembled beneath 1,000,000 feet. Europe watched as the emperor rode at their head, his grey coat and bicorn hat stark against the rising sun. He did not look back. And as the columns disappeared into the haze, the wind carried eastward the sound of a dream breaking the dream. Of one man's will stretched across an entire continent, now marching toward the endless snows that would test not only his genius, but the limits of human ambition itself. The Spanish inferno, the sun of Spain burned unlike any other, the kind that bleached bones and broke armies. The land itself seemed to resist invasion, as if the very soil had memory and refused to forget its independence. By 1808, the empire Napoleon had built upon brilliance and fear began to bleed here, in the dust of Iberia, among olive groves and stone villages, where farmers became soldiers and priests became generals. The Peninsular War, as Europe would later call it, began as an extension of strategy, another calculated step in Napoleon's great continental system. He had meant merely to enforce the blockade against Britain, to secure the western flank of his empire by compelling Portugal and Spain to obey his will. Yet Spain was not a country easily conquered. Its people, deeply bound to faith, land, and ancient pride, saw not liberation in French banners, but blasphemy. Napoleon had replaced the Spanish Bourbon king with his brother Joseph. To the French, it was a simple matter of dynastic reorganization. To the Spaniards, it was sacrilege. The monarchy had been theirs for centuries, sanctified by blood and God. When news of the foreign king spread, towns erupted in fury. The uprising began in Madrid on a May morning, a spontaneous, brutal revolt. The crowd surged through the streets shouting for the Virgin, and the old king, French troops taken by surprise, opened fire. The rebellion was drowned in blood, yet the blood became seed. Word of the massacre carried through Spain like fire through dry grass. In Zaragoza, Seville, Burgos, and the mountain villages of Asturias, the cry went up, "Muera el invasor," death to the invader. The Spanish people rose not as one army, but as thousands of small, ungovernable flames. Napoleon's generals, hardened veterans of Austerlitz and Jena, found themselves fighting ghosts. Columns marched through the valleys only to vanish into ambushes. Peasants struck from behind stone walls, then melted into the hills. Convoys disappeared. Whole companies were swallowed by forests and never seen again. The emperor, hearing of the chaos, refused to believe it. He thought it a matter of discipline, of control. "A few victories," he told his staff, "and Spain will quiet itself." He decided to go there himself, to impose order by presence alone. In November 1808, he crossed the Pyrenees at the head of 200,000 men. The advance was magnificent. The French moved like thunder, crushing the Spanish armies one after another. At Burgos, he scattered them like dust. At Madrid, he entered triumphantly, his soldiers in perfect ranks, his eagles glinting in the winter sun. The capital fell, but even as he entered the city, resistance grew anew in the countryside. Spain was not a state, it was an instinct. For every battle won, 10 more began in the shadows. Villages that had greeted him with silence erupted into rebellion the moment his columns passed. The priests preached war from their pulpits, waving crucifixes like swords. In monasteries, bells tolled not for prayer, but for vengeance. The French army found itself trapped in an invisible war. No front, no peace, no mercy. The term guerrilla, meaning little war, was born here, and it would haunt empires forever after. British troops under Arthur Wellesley later, the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal to aid the insurgents. Calm, deliberate and implacable, he became the first commander to stand against Napoleon's marshals and not falter. The war turned from nuisance to nightmare. Napoleon himself could not remain in Spain long. His empire demanded his attention elsewhere. Austria was stirring, and Russia's alliance wavered. He left behind his marshals to finish the work, but none possessed his genius. They fought bravely, yet they fought blind. The land itself consumed them. Years dragged on. The war that had begun as a calculated political move became a chasm into which the empire poured its strength. Over 500,000 French soldiers would march into Spain over 6 long years. Few returned. The cruelty on both sides was unspeakable. Villages were burned, prisoners executed, civilians slaughtered in reprisal. entire provinces turned to ash. In the mountains, the French soldiers, once proud legions of Austerlitz, became gaunt spectres. They fought not for glory now, but for survival. The Spanish peasants, driven by fury and faith, showed no fear. The war was no longer between nations, it was between civilization and endurance. For Napoleon, Spain became an obsession. Letters poured into Paris from the front requests for reinforcements, supplies and mercy. He ignored them. His mind had already turned toward the east, toward Russia. Spain was a problem of persistence, not intellect. He believed it would resolve itself. "They will tire of war," he said. But it was not the Spaniards who tired. It was France. The empire's treasury drained like sand through fingers. The finest officers of Europe lay buried in Iberian soil. Each victory brought no peace, only more rebellion. The once unstoppable momentum of Napoleon's armies slowed under the heat, the dust, the unending defiance of a people who refused to be conquered. In 1809, at Talavera, the French were checked by Wellesley's British forces. At Salamanca and Vittoria, years later, they would be driven back entirely. The eagles that had flown proudly over Madrid now retreated toward the Pyrenees, battered and bleeding. Napoleon called it the Spanish Ulcer, but it was more than a wound. It was rot beneath the skin of empire. His generals, once loyal beyond question, began to doubt. His allies began to waver. The myth of invincibility cracked. While his soldiers bled in the ravines of Spain, the emperor pursued grandeur elsewhere. He remarried, fathered an heir, and presided over ceremonies that seemed to proclaim eternal peace. Yet the whispers grew louder, that the empire was stretched too thin, that the emperor's will had become too absolute, too blind. In the salons of Paris, diplomats murmured that he fought too many wars, ruled too many lands, demanded too much of human endurance. In the villages, mothers cursed the name that had once filled them with pride. Conscription tore sons from fields already emptied by hunger. The empire had begun to feed upon itself, and still the drums rolled. In 1811, as the war in Spain dragged into its fourth year, Napoleon prepared his grandest gamble, the invasion of Russia. His ministers pleaded with him to wait, to consolidate, to end the bleeding in the west before striking east. He dismissed their counsel. To stop, he said, is to die. Spain burned behind him, its people still fighting in the hills. The British held firm along the coast. His marshals wrote home of despair, but he no longer listened. He saw only the vastness of his own destiny, and destiny in his mind could not be questioned. The Peninsular War had revealed something no battlefield had before, that courage, even when outmatched, could outlast genius. Spain did not defeat Napoleon by strategy or force, but by endurance, by the simple refusal to bow. When, years later, the French finally withdrew, the land they left behind was a wasteland. Cities half ruined, harvests destroyed, a generation dead. Yet the people remained, unbroken. They had faced the greatest army in history, and survived. For the empire, however, the cost was mortal. Spain had drained its blood, its treasure, its myth. The emperor had built his power upon motion and victory. Spain had given him stillness and failure. It was the first shadow of decline, the first whisper that even he was not eternal. And as the fires of rebellion smouldered behind him, Napoleon turned his gaze toward the endless expanse of Russia, believing that one more conquest would silence doubt forever. He could not know that the snows awaiting him there would make Spain's deserts seem merciful by comparison. The Spanish sun, which had burned his legions to exhaustion, now sank behind him. Before him stretched a horizon of frost and fate, the Russian winter. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the zenith of human power, the crowned master of Europe. From Lisbon to Warsaw, from Rome to Amsterdam, his decrees carried the weight of thunder. The eagle of France had soared higher than any before it. Yet the sky above him, brilliant and blue, held the faint shimmer of a storm that would break not upon his enemies first, but upon himself. The decision that summer to march into the vast empire of Russia would transform triumph into tragedy and immortality into myth. The invasion began as an idea, born of defiance. Tsar Alexander I, once Napoleon's uneasy ally, had begun to slip from his grasp. Russia had defied the continental system, trading once more with Britain. To Napoleon, it was treachery against the great order he had built, the final affront to his vision of a world united under his rule. "I must crush the Russian colossus," he declared, "or it will crush me." He would gather the greatest army the world had ever seen, the Grande Armée, over 600,000 soldiers, French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Croats, Swiss, an army drawn from every corner of Europe. It was not merely a force, it was an empire in motion. Alongside them marched engineers, doctors, wagoners, blacksmiths and merchants. 60,000 horses pulled artillery, wagons and supplies. The columns stretched for miles, gleaming beneath the June sun, their drums beating the steady rhythm of destiny. On the 24th of June, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River. He paused upon its banks, silent, watching the shimmering water. "From this place," he said quietly, "we shall bring peace to the world." Then, raising his hand, he gave the order to advance. The crossing was as grand as any coronation, a procession of ambition and arrogance rolling eastward toward the horizon. The first weeks brought triumph. Vilnius fell, then Vitebsk. The Russian armies, commanded by Generals Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, retreated deeper into the wilderness, burning villages and fields behind them. Napoleon had expected swift engagement, a decisive battle to crush the enemy and force peace. Instead, he found only empty roads, scorched earth, and silence. The farther he marched, the more the landscape itself seemed to resist him. The forests grew denser, the rivers broader, the roads fewer. Summer rains turned the fields into swamps. Supply lines stretched thin, wagons broke, horses died by the thousands. Hunger gnawed even before the enemy struck. At Smolensk, the Russians made their first stand, but only briefly. Napoleon's artillery turned the city to fire, its wooden houses collapsing in sheets of flame. When the smoke cleared, the Russians were gone again, vanishing into the east. The Emperor, victorious yet unsatisfied, pressed onward. Each day took him farther from France, farther from the order he understood, deeper into a land that seemed endless and unknowable. At last, in early September, near a small village called Borodino, the Russians halted. The two armies faced one another across a misty plain. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Napoleon studied the field from a low hill, his spyglass glinting in the light. Before him stood an army of 250,000 men, his against theirs, Europe against the steppes. "We are at last upon the field of destiny," he murmured. The battle began at dawn on the 7th of September 1812. Cannon fire thundered across the plain, shaking the ground. Columns of French infantry advanced through smoke so thick that men could see only the flash of bayonets beside them. The Russians fought with ferocity, their defences layered and deep. For 12 hours the two sides battered each other, trading slaughter for slaughter. The air grew black with powder. Horses screamed. The sky itself seemed to weep ash. By nightfall, the field was a vision from hell. Tens of thousands dead or dying, the wounded crying for water among the corpses. Napoleon stood beside his campfire, silent, his face illuminated by the glow. The Russians had retreated, but not defeated. Victory was his by claim, not conviction. He had won the field, but not the war. 2 days later, the Grande Armée marched into Moscow. The city, the ancient heart of Russia, lay strangely quiet beneath a pale sky. The gilded domes of its churches glittered. Its streets were empty. Napoleon rode at the head of his guard, expecting surrender. But Moscow was no prize, it was a trap. That night, Fires erupted across the city. Flames leapt from house to house, driven by wind. The sky turned crimson. Smoke rolled like waves over the rooftops. The French tried to fight the fire, but it was everywhere. Within hours, most of Moscow burned. The Russians had abandoned their capital, leaving behind only ash. Napoleon stood in the Kremlin, watching the inferno through shattered windows. The heat seared his face. He said nothing for a long while, then whispered, "So this is how they make war." The words were not anger, they were awe. The Russians would rather destroy their city than yield it. He waited 5 weeks for Alexander to sue for peace. None came. The Tsar would not answer his letters. Outside, the Russian winter approached. The nights grew colder. The stores of food vanished. Horses starved. In the ruined streets, soldiers tore apart furniture for firewood. Men froze to death in their tents. At last, realizing the futility, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. It was October. Snow began to fall. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest force in the world, now became a column of suffering. The roads they had marched in triumph turned to rivers of ice. Wagons splintered, cannons sank into drifts. Men stumbled barefoot through the snow. Frostbite blackened limbs, hunger hollowed faces. Wolves followed the columns at night, drawn by the dead. At first, the retreat was orderly. Napoleon still rode at the front, calm and silent. But soon, order dissolved into chaos. The rear guard fought constant skirmishes with Cossacks, their sabres flashing in the white gloom. Soldiers stripped corpses for clothing. Discipline vanished. "The army is dying," Marshal Ney whispered. But the emperor pressed on, refusing to acknowledge defeat. At Smolensk, they found only ruins. The supply depots were empty. Men gnawed on leather belts to quiet their hunger. Disease spread through the ranks, dysentery, typhus, frost. Entire divisions vanished overnight. Then came the crossing of the Berezina River. The bridges had been destroyed. The Russians closed in from both sides. Napoleon ordered pontoons built under fire. For 2 days, men, horses and wagons fought to cross the icy torrent. Thousands drowned, crushed or froze in the current. Yet the emperor, astonishingly calm, directed the crossing as cannonballs crashed around him. "We shall pass," he said simply. They did, but at a cost too great to count. By December, what had begun as 600,000 men was reduced to fewer than 30,000. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across the frozen wilderness. The Grande Armée ceased to exist. When Napoleon finally crossed back into Poland, he was gaunt, exhausted, and silent. His uniform hung loose upon his frame. His eyes were hollow, but his composure unbroken. He had lost an empire's worth of men, yet he still carried the bearing of command. In Warsaw, he received word that conspiracies were stirring in Paris, that his allies in Germany were faltering. He said little. Then, one freezing night in December, he slipped away, leaving his army to Marshal Murat, and began the long, secret journey back to France. He travelled in a small sleigh across Europe, through snow and darkness, wrapped in a cloak, his face hidden. Villagers who saw him pass never guessed that the ghostly figure racing through the night was the ruler of the world. He arrived in Paris on the 18th of December, 1812. At the Tuileries, he stepped from his carriage and walked into the palace, unannounced. Ministers gasped when they saw him. "The Emperor," someone whispered. He ignored the shock and went straight to his desk. "The army needs rebuilding," he said simply, as if the catastrophe had been nothing more than a setback. But the spell was broken. The myth of invincibility, the illusion of destiny, had perished in the snows of Russia. Europe, sensing weakness, stirred once more. The Allies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, prepared to rise. The campaign of 1812 had revealed not only the limits of France, but the limits of one man's will. Napoleon's genius could conquer armies, but not distance, not winter, not time. His dream of a united Europe, held together by reason and law, had frozen and shattered on the Russian plains. Still, in his own heart, he refused to yield. He wrote to his ministers, dictated orders, planned new campaigns. "Fortune," he said, "has the face of a woman. She loves the bold." Yet the world he had built was already tilting away from him. The crowns he had placed upon others' heads began to tremble. The allies he had created turned their eyes toward vengeance. Across the continent, the once silent cities of Europe began to whisper his name not in worship, but in warning. Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of kings, builder of nations, had looked into the infinite and tried to master it. The snows of Russia had looked back and answered with silence. The empire still stood, but its foundations had cracked. And in the quiet of the Tuileries, as he worked beneath the candlelight, Napoleon surely knew that he was no longer chasing destiny, he was running from it. The Russian winter had not merely destroyed his army, it had destroyed the illusion that he was anything more than mortal. The man who had marched into Moscow as Caesar returned to Paris as Job, tested by the gods he had once defied. But still he wrote, still he planned, still he dreamed. For a man who had built his life upon motion, could not stop, not even as the world began to close in around him. The fall of an emperor. The snows of Russia melted into the mud of spring, and with them the grandeur of the French Empire began to dissolve. What had once seemed eternal, the glittering courts, the invincible armies, the unquestioned authority now trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion and rebellion. In 1813, Europe rose as one body against Napoleon Bonaparte. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the conqueror of nations was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. The disaster in Russia had been total, but Napoleon refused to see it as the end. His enemies believed him broken. They underestimated the resilience of his will. Within months of returning to Paris, he summoned new armies from the soil of France as if conjuring them by sheer force of command. Boys barely 16 were given uniforms and muskets, their faces pale but their hearts filled with pride. "Give me men," he told his ministers, "and I will give you victory." He rebuilt the machine of war with terrifying speed. Cannons were refitted, cavalry remounted, generals recalled from retirement. Europe had expected him to retreat into history's shadows. Instead, he marched once more into its centre. In April 1813, he took the field in Germany, with an army less experienced but no less determined. Against him stood a coalition of giants, Russia, Prussia, Britain, and later Austria, all united by one purpose, to destroy him completely. At Lutzen and Bautzen, he struck first, moving with the same precision that had once astonished the world. His victories there reminded Europe that genius does not die easily. Yet even as the eagles triumphed again, the cost grew unbearable. The young conscripts fought bravely, but their inexperience showed. His marshals, once unstoppable, now hesitated. His enemies no longer feared him as they once had. Napoleon's letters from this time carry the rhythm of fatigue. The sentences are short, the tone cold. Gone are the grand phrases of destiny. In their place is iron pragmatism. "Everything is lost," he once told his aide, "save honour and the habit of command." Still, he fought on. The summer of 1813 brought his last great victories at Dresden, where he crushed a larger army through sheer will and the brilliance of manoeuvre. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, unsure whether the tide had truly turned. But fortune, once his constant companion, had begun to betray him. At Leipzig, in October, came the reckoning. Nearly 500,000 men faced one another across the Saxon plains, the largest battle Europe had ever seen. The Battle of Nations, it would be called, for almost every European power had come to defeat him. For 3 days, cannon fire rolled like thunder. Rivers ran red with the blood of soldiers, who fought not only for nations but for eras, the age of kings against the age of revolution. Napoleon fought like a man possessed, riding through smoke and fire, rallying his troops, directing attacks with that old, uncanny instinct. But his allies within Germany began to turn. Saxon soldiers, once his vassals, defected mid-battle, firing upon their former comrades. Confusion spread, lines broke. The emperor, surrounded, ordered retreat. The French crossed the Ulster River under bombardment. A bridge was blown too soon. Thousands were trapped on the far bank, cut off and slaughtered. Napoleon watched from a distance, his face unmoving, his eyes dark and distant. He had seen death before, but never like this, never so final, never so meaningless. Leipzig was more than defeat. It was collapse. The spell was broken. The illusion of invincibility that had held Europe in thrall vanished in the smoke of that battle. His army, once the instrument of his will, was shattered. Only fragments remained to cover his retreat. He fell back across the Rhine, back into France itself. For the first time since the Revolution, the enemy marched on French soil. The fields that had once given sons to his wars now saw those sons returning as ashes. Paris trembled. The people, weary from years of conscription and taxes, no longer cheered his name. The tricolour still flew, but the faith that had sustained it wavered. In the salons, whispers grew bold. Perhaps the emperor had taken too much from France. Perhaps the glory had always been an illusion purchased in blood. Napoleon refused despair. "I am still the same man," he told his ministers. "Give me 1 year of victory, and they will all come back to me." He gathered the remnants of his army veterans from Spain, boys from the countryside, the wounded from hospitals, and led them himself into the fields of Champagne. There, in the early months of 1814, he fought a campaign of genius and desperation. Outnumbered 10-1, he struck at his enemies with lightning precision, winning battles that seemed impossible. Montmirail, Champoba, Montereau. His movements were poetry in motion, his timing flawless. Even his enemies marvelled. "He is like a lion in winter," one Austrian general said. "Wounded but magnificent." But brilliance could not replace numbers. For every victory, 2 defeats followed elsewhere. The Allies pressed inexorably toward Paris, their lines tightening like a noose. His marshals, loyal but weary, urged him to make peace. He would not hear of it. "Better to die with the sword in hand," he said, "than to live in shame." By March, the Allied armies reached the gates of the capital. Napoleon was still in the field when the city surrendered. His wife, Marie-Louise, fled with their young son, the King of Rome. The tricolour was lowered. The white flag of the Bourbons, the very symbol of the monarchy he had once destroyed, rose again over the Tuileries. When news reached him, he stood silent for a long time, then said only, "They have betrayed me." He rode back toward Fontainebleau, the great palace where he had once planned the future of Europe. Now it was to be his prison. There, on the 6th of April, 1814, the Emperor of the French abdicated. "My political life is ended," he declared in a statement to his soldiers. "I go to join my brave companions in exile. The interests of the fatherland are above mine." The room was silent as he signed the document, his hand steady. Outside, the old guard, the veterans of Italy, Egypt, and Austerlitz stood assembled in the courtyard. He walked among them in his grey coat, the same he had worn in countless campaigns. Tears glistened in their eyes. "I cannot embrace you all," he said softly, "but I will press you all to my heart." Then, raising his hand, he gave them a final salute. A few days later, under guard, he left France. His carriage rolled through villages that had once greeted him with flowers and now watched in silence. He looked out the window but said nothing. At the southern coast, he boarded a small British frigate. Its sails caught the wind, and France receded into mist. His destination was the island of Elba, a speck in the Tyrrhenian Sea, a mockery of empire. There he would reign, the Allies decreed, as sovereign of a rock no larger than a province. They thought to humiliate him by making him king of nothing. Yet even in exile his energy did not die. On Elba he reorganized everything: roads, mines, agriculture, schools. The tiny island became a miniature reflection of France. He rose early, inspected docks, rode through the hills, issued decrees. The locals adored him. But at night, when the sea wind whispered through the palms, he would walk alone along the cliffs, staring toward the horizon. France lay beyond that horizon, just out of reach. The Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, had returned to the throne, but the old order could not reclaim the hearts of the people. The veterans, the officers, the citizens who had once lived under the empire's glory, all felt the same emptiness. They remembered not tyranny, but purpose. Napoleon's name lingered in every barracks, every marketplace, every whisper of discontent. In February 1815, word reached him that France was restless, that soldiers still loyal to him cursed the white flag in secret. He made his decision instantly. "They will call me reckless," he told his aide. But fortune favours the bold. On the night of February 26, he slipped past his British guards, boarded a small ship with a few hundred men, and set sail for France once more. The sea was rough, but his spirit was calm. "Elba is too small for me," he said. "I was born to command worlds." As the coast of Provence appeared in the dawn light, he smiled faintly. "We go to France," he said, "and to destiny." The fall of an emperor was not yet the end. The man who had once ruled Europe would rise once more, not as conqueror, but as legend reborn from defeat. The world thought him buried. He would prove otherwise. And as the wind carried his ship toward the shore, the waves broke softly against the hull as though the sea itself recognized its master's return. The 100 days. The early dawn of the 1st of March, 1815, found the southern coast of France bathed in pale gold, the sea calm as glass. A small ship, the Inconstant, drifted toward the rocky shore near Gulf Juan. From its deck stepped a figure the world had thought finished. Napoleon Bonaparte, once Emperor of the French, now an exile escaped from a forgotten island. He wore no crown, no parade uniform, only his grey greatcoat and bicorn hat, the same attire that had marched through Europe and into legend. Behind him followed a handful of veterans, some 300 men faithful to the last. They carried no banners, only the memory of drums that once shook continents. He gazed across the coastline in silence. The hills shimmered in the dawn light, and the air smelled of salt and spring. "France," he said softly, "I have returned to you." The plan was madness, a single man against the armies of kings. Yet madness had never deterred him. From this shore he would march north, across 700 miles of hostile territory, through garrisons sworn to arrest him, until he reached Paris. It would be the final campaign not of conquest, but of resurrection. He began at once. The little column moved inland, climbing narrow roads through the Alps, sleeping in barns and under open sky. Word spread ahead of him like a spark through dry grass. "The Emperor has landed." At first, local officials sent detachments to capture him. But when the soldiers saw him, saw the grey coat, the calm eyes, the unmistakable bearing, they hesitated. At Grenoble, a regiment barred his way. Napoleon advanced alone, unarmed. "Soldiers!" he called. "Do you not know me? If any man would shoot his emperor, let him do so now." The silence broke into cheers. Rifles dropped. Shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" filled the air. The regiment joined him. The march became a procession. Every garrison that was meant to stop him instead fell in line behind him. France, weary of the Bourbon's stiffness, felt its old pulse quicken again. The tricolour appeared in windows. Crowds lined the roads. In Paris, panic spread through the royal court. The Bourbon king fled, abandoning his throne once more. On March 20, Napoleon entered the capital to a storm of jubilation. Cannons boomed, bells rang, and the streets overflowed with tears and laughter. The exiled emperor had returned as if from the grave. He stepped into the Tuileries palace at dusk, the same halls he had left in defeat barely a year before. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, and the mirrors reflected an older, leaner face. He smiled faintly. "They thought me buried," he murmured, "but I am a seed." So began what history would call the 100 Days, a brief, blazing resurrection of empire. He moved quickly, with his old clarity. Decrees flew from his desk. Censorship relaxed, taxes adjusted, old veterans recalled. He spoke to the people not as a tyrant returned, but as a father to his children. "I have come," he said, "not to restore despotism, but to secure liberty." He promised peace, constitution, reconciliation. Many believed him, for they wished to believe. But Europe did not. The crowned heads of the continent, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, reacted with fury and fear. The old alliances, fractured since his fall, fused again in a single instant. They declared him an outlaw, an enemy of mankind, a disturber of the world's peace. Armies began to march toward France before his proclamations could even dry. Napoleon knew that diplomacy was futile. The kings would not rest while he lived. "They have learned nothing," he said, "and they have forgotten nothing." He would fight one last time. Through March and April he rebuilt his army. Veterans flocked to his banner, grey-haired sergeants who had fought at Austerlitz and Jena, boys who had grown up on tales of his glory. In weeks he gathered 200,000 men, the last Grande Armée. Yet the France he ruled now was weary, smaller and poorer. The empire's strength was gone, its spirit alone remained. He worked without pause, dictating strategy, inspecting arsenals, drafting constitutions. He was thinner now, his step heavier, but the energy that had carried him across 2 decades of war still burned within him. His officers, watching him map out another campaign, whispered that it was as if time had turned back. His plan was audacious. He would strike first, dividing the coalition before their armies could unite. The British, under Wellington, were gathering in Belgium, the Prussians under Blucher nearby. He would fall upon them between the rivers Sambre and Meuse, defeat them in detail, and force Europe once more to the table. In June, he set his army in motion. The fields of northern France bloomed with grain, the sky bright and warm. It seemed a season meant for harvest, not war, but destiny had chosen otherwise. On June 16, at Ligny, Napoleon won his last victory, defeating the Prussians in a fierce battle of smoke and blood. But 2 days later, at a small Belgian village named Waterloo, fate turned against him forever. The day dawned grey and wet. Rain had soaked the fields, turning the ground to mud. Napoleon, ill and weary, surveyed the ridges through his glass. Opposite him stood Wellington's army, drawn up on the high ground, calm and silent behind hedgerows and walls. The French guns opened fire at 11. The battle began. All morning the French attacked in waves. Cannon thundered, muskets flashed, cavalry charged across the fields. At La Haye-Sainte, at Hougoumont, at the farm of Papelotte, men fought like beasts in the mud. Every assault met iron resistance. Wellington, grim and unflinching, moved his reserves with perfect timing. By afternoon, the field was chaos. The emperor rode among his troops, rallying them with gestures more than words. His face was grey with fatigue. His eyes burned with that old, terrifying calm. "One more effort," he said, "and the day is ours." At 6 in the evening, he launched his final blow. The Imperial Guard, his chosen veterans, the men who had never known defeat. They marched up the slope toward the British line, drums rolling, bayonets glittering in the fading light. "Vive l'Empereur!" they cried. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the ridge erupted in musket fire. Entire ranks fell in an instant. The guard staggered, reformed, advanced again and was shattered. Someone shouted, "La garde recule!" The guard is retreating. Panic swept the field. The cry spread like lightning through the French ranks. Sauve qui peut, every man for himself. The army broke, horses fled riderless, cannon overturned, flags fell into the mud. Napoleon, surrounded by chaos, sat motionless for a long moment, staring into the smoke. At last he whispered, "It is over." Night fell heavy upon the field of Waterloo. Tens of thousands lay dead or dying. The rain returned, washing the blood into the soil. The empire had ended where it began, in courage and ruin. He fled south toward Paris, his carriage rattling through villages still unaware of the disaster. In the capital, the news spread like wildfire. The chambers of government turned against him. Peace, they demanded, at any price. On the 22nd of June 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. "My political life is finished," he said quietly. "I proclaim my son emperor under the name Napoleon II." Few listened. He walked alone through the gardens of the Élysée, the air thick with the scent of summer rain. He looked up at the clouds, murmuring, "Everything I have loved is gone." He attempted to flee to America, hoping to live in obscurity, perhaps to write his memoirs, but British ships waited in every port. Finally, he surrendered himself to the captain of HMS Bellerophon. "I come," he said, like Themistocles, to seek the hospitality of the British people. But mercy was not to be his fate. The victors decided that Europe could never sleep while he breathed free. They exiled him once more, this time to the island of St. Helena, a lonely speck of rock in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from any shore. As he boarded the ship that would take him there, he turned for one last look at France. The coastline shimmered faintly in the dawn. "France," he whispered. "Beautiful France, farewell." He had ruled her for 15 years, conquered a continent, and written his name across history's fabric in letters of fire. Now, as the sails filled and the sea swallowed the horizon, the story of the 100 Days closed not in triumph, but in something greater, the serene, terrible majesty of finality. For a brief moment a man had bent the world to his will, and though the world had broken him, it could never erase what he had been, the island of exile. The journey to St. Helena lasted more than 2 months, a slow drift into silence. The sea stretched endless and indifferent, its grey surface broken only by the white foam at the bow of HMS Northumberland. Within its narrow cabin sat Napoleon Bonaparte, once Emperor of the French, now a prisoner of Europe. He had crossed the Alps, the Nile, and the Russian steppe. Now he crossed only the void between memory and oblivion. He kept his dignity even in captivity. He rose at dawn, as he had in the Tuileries, shaved carefully, and took breakfast with measured calm. His attendants, Generals Bertrand, Montholon, and Gourgaud, along with his valet Marchand, watched as he reviewed his few possessions, maps, medals, a portrait of his son. The routine, even in chains, gave him the illusion of command. "I must live as if I still govern," he said. "An emperor, even fallen, must rule something if only himself." As the days passed, the air grew warmer, heavier with salt. The stars shone brighter at night than they ever had over Europe. He often stood alone on the quarterdeck, the sea wind tugging at his grey coat. Sailors avoided his gaze, uneasy at the sight of a legend reduced to solitude. To some, he still seemed taller than life itself, a ghost of power adrift on the waves. In October 1815, St. Helena appeared at last, a jagged island rising from the South Atlantic like the crown of a drowned volcano. Its cliffs were black and steep, its shores beaten by constant surf. There were no cities, no forests, only wind and stone. "So," Napoleon murmured as he looked upon it, "this is my last battlefield." He was taken ashore at Jamestown, a small port clinging to the rock. British soldiers lined the path, their muskets gleaming in the tropical sun. The locals stared in silence. They had never seen such a man, and never would again. From there, he was escorted to Longwood House, a low, damp estate atop a windswept plateau. The air there was cool and thick with fog. The rain fell almost daily. Mould crept across the walls, and the wind moaned through the shutters like an endless lament. "This place," he said upon seeing it, "is fit only for my tomb." The governor of the island, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a soldier of discipline, but little imagination. His orders were clear: no escape, no communication without supervision. Guards patrolled day and night. Even Napoleon's letters were opened and censored. He was allowed companions but denied liberty. The emperor, who had commanded millions, could now walk only within a few fenced acres. At first he bore it with composure. He filled the days with ritual, dictating memoirs, reading classics, walking the garden paths with hands clasped behind his back. He spoke often of Caesar, Alexander, and Charlemagne, comparing his fate to theirs. "They died amid the glory they made," he mused. "I die among stones." In the afternoons, he rode slowly along the high ridges, gazing out over the endless horizon. Sometimes he spoke to Bertrand of battles long past, describing manoeuvres as if still commanding them. "At Austerlitz," he would say, eyes distant, "I saw everything at once, the mist, the hills, the enemy's mind. That was the day I felt myself truly emperor." At other times he fell silent for hours, listening to the surf far below, as if the sea itself carried echoes of cannon fire and cheering troops. At night, under the southern stars, he grew restless. Sleep often fled him. He would rise and pace the room, his shadow flickering in the candlelight. On some nights he dreamed aloud, calling the names of his marshals, his wife, his son. When Marchand would enter, he would simply say, "The battle continues," and return to bed. The months bled into years. The harsh climate gnawed at his health. The damp air worsened his stomach pains. His skin grew sallow, his frame heavier. Yet even as his body failed, his mind remained sharp. He dictated memoirs that would outlive every fortress and cannon, weaving the story of his life not as tragedy but as destiny. He was not writing for his captors, but for history. His words carried the calm of judgment and the grandeur of myth. "I am not a man like other men," he told Bertrand one evening. "I have witnessed the limits of power. I have seen what it means to hold the world in one's hand and to lose it." He spoke of France, often its rivers, its fields, its people. "They will remember me," he said. "Not as I am now, but as I was riding beneath the tricolour, the drums beating, the eagles shining in the sun." He never once blamed them for abandoning him. "The French love glory," he said with a faint smile. "They will forgive much for it." The British guards treated him with wary respect. Some pitied him, some despised him. All feared his presence. Even in defeat he commanded the air around him. When he passed, conversation ceased. The sailors whispered that storms followed his moods, that when he was angry, the wind rose and the sea roared. Time slowed. The empire he had built continued to change without him. His son, the King of Rome, grew up in Vienna under Austrian care, forbidden even to bear his father's name. France itself settled into uneasy peace beneath the restored Bourbons. Yet across Europe, veterans and poets spoke of him in secret, their voices filled with longing. His shadow lay over every throne. In 1818, the isolation deepened. Lowe restricted visitors and correspondence further, suspecting plots of escape. Napoleon, weary of the governor's pettiness, withdrew from conversation. "They fear me still," he remarked dryly, "and that is my last victory." His health declined sharply in 1820. The pain in his stomach worsened. Fever came and went. Yet he continued to dictate whenever strength allowed. The pages piled high, an empire reborn in ink. "If they will not let me live as a soldier," he said, "I will die as a writer of my own legend." He refused despair. To Bertrand he once confided, "They think exile will erase me, but time will carve my name deeper than their kings." By the spring of 1821, he could scarcely walk. The doctors called it cancer of the stomach. He called it fate. He slept often now, dreaming of France. In those final days, he asked his companions to read aloud from Plutarch and Ossian. The sound of old heroes filled the room. On the 5th of May, 1821, a storm swept across the island, the wind howling against Longwood's walls. Napoleon drifted in and out of consciousness. Around him gathered the last of his faithful, the generals who had followed him from empire to exile. His breathing grew shallow. He whispered, "France, army, Josephine." The words barely formed, yet their echo filled the room. At 5:49 p.m, he exhaled once more and was still. Outside, the rain stopped. The clouds broke, and sunlight touched the sea. A soldier lowered the tricolour that still hung, faded but defiant, over the garden fence. The man who had ruled half the world now lay in silence, a shadow among shadows, his greatness reduced to the size of a single room. He was buried on a slope beneath a cluster of willows, his grave unmarked by name, only by the sound of the wind. The island fell quiet again, but the quiet was not forgetfulness. It was reverence. Even his captors felt it. They had not buried a man. They had buried an age. Years later, when word reached Europe, a hush spread through every court and barracks. Some rejoiced, others wept. But all knew the same truth. An era had ended. The last titan of the revolution had gone to join the gods of war. And though he had died upon a rock at the edge of the world, his legend began anew. The legend returns to France. Longwood House slept in silence after Napoleon's death, but the world beyond its misted hills was already beginning to awaken to his legend. Even before his body cooled, his story began to pass from the realm of politics into the realm of myth. The man who had once terrified kings was no longer an emperor in exile. He was becoming an immortal idea. News of his death reached Europe months later, carried by slow ships and cautious dispatches. When the British government confirmed it, the crowned heads of Europe greeted it with quiet relief. "The nightmare has ended," one statesman said. But even as they spoke, they sensed that the shadow he had cast would not fade so easily. Napoleon had been defeated on every battlefield but one, the memory of mankind, and on that field he would never lose. In France, the reaction was unlike anything the monarchs expected. The Bourbon court, still uneasy on its throne, received the news with cold propriety, but in the streets and villages people wept. Veterans who had fought beneath his eagles lit candles before small portraits. Peasants who had never seen him in life whispered prayers for his soul. His name, banned by decree, was spoken again in every marketplace, every tavern, every soldier's home. The legend of Napoleon grew with every telling. Poets compared him to Caesar and Alexander. Painters imagined him crossing the Alps in eternal triumph. Mothers told their children stories of the young general who had risen from nothing to rule the world. He became both saint and sinner, hero and warning, light and shadow of a nation's soul. His old enemies had tried to chain him to an island, but his memory broke those chains with ease. Years passed. The Bourbon monarchy staggered beneath its own frailty, despised by liberals and veterans alike. France was changing again, industrializing, restless, hungry for meaning. The generation that had grown up in the empire's glow could not forget its promise of glory and order. Even those who had cursed the wars now looked back on them with nostalgia, longing for the unity and pride that the little Corsican had brought. By the 1830s, Napoleon's image had become a mirror for France itself. Painters depicted him as a visionary, standing atop windswept cliffs. Writers reimagined him as a martyr of genius, crushed by the mediocrity of kings. Victor Hugo, then a young poet, called him the man who fell from the heights of Olympus. The people no longer saw a fallen emperor, they saw a symbol of greatness lost. In 1840, almost 2 decades after his death, a new French king, Louis Philippe, sought to heal the divisions of the nation. He made a decision that stunned the world. Napoleon's remains would be brought home. The British agreed, and the French ship La Belle Poule, painted black with silver trim, sailed for St. Helena under the command of the young Prince de Joinville. When it arrived, the island seemed unchanged, silent, windswept, eternal. The British guards led the French officers to the valley where the emperor had been buried. The willows still drooped low, the air heavy with salt and memory. Soldiers uncovered the coffin, layer by layer, iron, lead, mahogany, until at last, after 19 years, they saw him again. Those present said his face had not decayed. He looked as though he slept, the features serene, the lips faintly curved. The soldiers fell to their knees. General Bertrand wept openly. "He is still our emperor," one whispered. His remains were placed aboard La Belle Poule, and as the ship set sail, the crew stood silent at attention. The cannons fired a final salute. The Atlantic winds that had once carried him into exile now carried him home. On a grey December morning in 1840, France welcomed her son. Crowds filled the harbour of Cherbourg, then lined the roads all the way to Paris. Men removed their hats, women threw flowers. Veterans in tattered uniforms saluted as the black-draped carriage passed, their faces lit with tears. It was as though the nation itself had been waiting 20 years to breathe again. The procession reached Paris on December 15. The capital, draped in mourning and pride, seemed to tremble with emotion. Hundreds of thousands filled the streets, their cries merging into a single chant. "Vive l'Empereur!" Bells rang from every tower. The air was thick with incense, snow, and the sound of drums beating slow and solemn, echoing like the heart of France itself. The coffin was carried across the Seine to the Invalides, the great domed church he had once admired as a young officer. Beneath its golden dome, surrounded by torchlight and silence, his body was laid to rest in a temporary tomb. "He sleeps now under the dome of his glory," wrote one observer. 2 decades later, under the rule of his nephew, Napoleon III, the final resting place was completed, a vast sarcophagus of red porphyry resting on a green granite base, encircled by laurelled victories and bronze angels. There, in the heart of Paris, beneath the dome of Les Invalides, the emperor found his eternal home. But Napoleon's true tomb was never of stone. It was the imagination of the world. His name crossed oceans and languages, carried by history's pulse. He became not merely a French hero, but a universal symbol, the embodiment of ambition, genius, and the tragic cost of greatness. In every century since, his shadow has loomed over statesmen and soldiers alike. Historians would debate him endlessly, tyrant or visionary, destroyer or creator, monster or genius. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. He was both the revolution's child and its conqueror, the man who brought order to chaos and chaos to order. He built a legal code that outlived him, a vision of merit that reshaped nations, and a myth that refused to die. In the long quiet after Waterloo, even his enemies began to revere him. The British, who had imprisoned him, placed his statue in their museums. The Russians and Austrians who had defeated him studied his campaigns. The Americans named towns and sons after him. And in France, his spirit became a kind of secular faith proof that greatness could rise from obscurity, that one man's will could bend the arc of history. Every generation since has rediscovered him in its own image. The soldier, the statesman, the strategist, the poet of power. He remains both warning and inspiration, a man too great for his age, or perhaps too human to escape it. When visitors enter the golden dome of Les Invalides today, they descend in silence. Light filters through the windows, falling softly upon the red marble sarcophagus. Around it, engraved upon the floor, are the names of his greatest victories: Austerlitz, Rivoli, Jena, Wagram. The air smells faintly of wax and stone. In that stillness, time seems to fold. One can almost hear the distant echo of drums, the whisper of wind over battlefields, the murmur of a man's voice saying, "France, my destiny." Beneath the marble rests the soldier who conquered Europe, the dreamer who tried to conquer time, and the man who, even in death, would not be forgotten. His empire may have crumbled, but his idea endures that greatness, born from courage and imagination, can rise from any shore, challenge the gods themselves, and, even in defeat, outlive them all. Napoleon Bonaparte returned to France not as emperor, not as conqueror, but as legend. And legends, unlike men, do not die, the eternal shadow. 2 centuries have passed since the drums of Napoleon Bonaparte last echoed through the valleys of Europe, yet his shadow remains long, sharp, and alive in the memory of humankind. His empire has long dissolved into dust, his banners folded, his eagles caged in glass, yet something of him endures everywhere, in the codes of law that govern nations, in the architecture of state that he reshaped, in the language of ambition itself. He has become less a man than a mirror in which the world still studies its hunger for greatness. When one walks through Paris at night, beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides where his tomb glows in candlelight, it is not silence one feels but presence. The air seems to hum with invisible drums. The marble floor bears the weight of memory itself. The man who was born on a rugged island and died on another now rests at the centre of the city he once ruled, his sarcophagus watched by sculpted angels in the eternal light of history. His story is that of the modern world, the rise from revolution, the triumph of will, the seduction of power, and the inevitable fall of excess. No other life so perfectly mirrors the rhythm of civilization itself. Birth in chaos, ascent through genius, glory at its peak, ruin through pride, and immortality through memory. Napoleon was not born a king. He was the son of minor Corsican nobility, a child of the Enlightenment, who read Rousseau and Plutarch by candlelight. He carried within him the fever of the age, a belief that reason could reshape humanity. The revolution gave him a stage, but it was his own mind that gave him direction. In his youth he dreamed of being a scholar. In his prime he became a conqueror. In his exile he became a philosopher. Few men have lived all the lives that he did within one span of years. He remade France from foundation to crown. His laws gave structure to chaos. His schools forged generations. His administration turned ideal into machinery. He took the fractured ideals of liberty and equality and tempered them with discipline, giving form to the modern state. Every government that followed him, in France and beyond, carried some trace of his design. Yet he was more than a statesman, he was an artist of destiny. His medium was not paint or marble, but men and nations. He thought in geometry, in movement, in sound. The drumbeat of armies across the plains of Europe was his symphony. His campaigns were works of composition, precision, harmony, rhythm, and climax. He wielded war as if it were art itself, and for a time the world watched in awe at the beauty of his destruction. But art, when pushed beyond reason, becomes madness, and power, when pursued beyond measure, becomes its own undoing. The same genius that built his empire also doomed it. He saw no limits, not in nations, not in nature, not even in time. He marched into Russia as though the seasons would obey him, as though distance would bow before his will. It was not the muskets or the snow that defeated him, but the illusion that destiny could be conquered. And yet, his failure only magnified him. Tragedy completes what triumph cannot. In defeat, he became larger than victory could ever make him. The world pitied and admired him in equal measure. He had fallen, but his fall illuminated the height from which he had once commanded. Writers, poets, and philosophers would make of him a symbol, the eternal hero undone by fate. Goethe saw in him the embodiment of the world's spirit. Beethoven dedicated, then revoked, a symphony in his honour. Byron, Hugo, and Tolstoy each made him their muse. Even those who loathed him could not escape him. He was a torrent, wrote Chateaubriand, that tore up the old world and left the soil ready for the new. In this way, Napoleon outlived himself. He was reimagined again and again, the military genius, the enlightened despot, the visionary of modern Europe, the tyrant of ambition. Each century reshaped his image to fit its needs. The Romantics made him a fallen star. The Nationalists made him a hero. The moderns see in him the warning of boundless will. No matter the age, he returns, because every generation, in its longing for greatness or fear of it, finds something of itself in him. The paradox of Napoleon is eternal. He was both destroyer and creator, liberator and oppressor, a man who gave Europe both its nightmares and its dreams. He abolished feudalism, yet crowned himself emperor. He preached equality, yet ruled with absolute power. He spread the ideals of revolution with the sword, then chained them to his own glory. He was the revolution's heir and its betrayer. His private life, too, mirrors that duality. In love, he was tender yet possessive. In friendship, loyal yet ruthless. To Josephine, he wrote letters of such passion that they still tremble on the page centuries later. "I awake filled with you," he once wrote. "Your image and the memory of last night's intoxication leave no rest to my senses." Yet the same man who penned those words could abandon her for an heir. His heart and his empire obeyed the same law. Conquest first, regret later. In the end, all that remained was memory. On St. Helena, stripped of armies and allies, he found himself again as the boy from Corsica, alone with the sea, the stars, and his thoughts. There, his genius turned inward. He looked back upon his life not with bitterness, but with the calm of one who understands that even ruin can serve greatness. "The world will be glad of me for the good I have done," he said near the end, and astonished at the evil. When he died, France had already changed beyond his reach. Yet France would never again be free of his shadow. His tomb in Paris became a shrine not to empire, but to possibility, the proof that one human being could, for a time, seize history in his hands and bend it toward his vision. To stand before that tomb today is to feel time itself pause. Beneath the great dome, surrounded by marble victories, lies not merely a man but a question. What is greatness? Is it measured in victories and crowns, or in the persistence of memory? Is it in what one builds, or in how one endures beyond destruction? Napoleon answered by living both extremes. His empire perished, yet his name endures wherever ambition breathes. His soldiers called him the Little Corporal, but history calls him something greater, the architect of the modern age. He showed the world that the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary lie only in the strength of imagination. Every generation that rises to power walks, knowingly or not, in the echoes of his footsteps. Leaders study his campaigns, revolutionaries quote his words, artists chase his contradictions. His presence lingers not as an empire of land, but as an empire of mind. And so, Napoleon Bonaparte, son of Corsica, master of Europe, exile of the Atlantic, lives on, unburied in the heart of time. His victories fade, his monuments crumble, but the idea of him remains immortal, that a single human being, armed with vision and audacity, can remake the world. He was both the warning and the wonder of his age, and of all ages to come. The tide that carried him to greatness has long since receded, but the imprint of his footsteps remains upon the sands of history, clear, deep, and eternal. For the man who once commanded the world's armies commands still the imagination of the world, and as night falls over Paris, and the Seine whispers past the gilded dome of Les Invalides, the lamps flicker softly against the stone. The city sleeps, but beneath it, beneath the marble and the silence, the emperor still dreams, forever restless, forever awake.